Chapter 23. Quid quod prefation praemunierem libellum, qua conor omnem offendiculi ansem praesidera. Nec quicquam ad abito, quin ea candidus omnibus faciat satis. Quid autem facius istis, cavel obi ingenii pertinatium sibi satisferi nolent, vel stupidior sint, quam ut satisfactionem intelligent. Non quam admittem Simonides dixit, Thessalos habitiors esse, quam ut passant a esse decipi, ita quastum vidius stupidiors, quam ut placeri ceant. Ad hic, non mirum est invenire quat calamiter, ca nihil aliud querit, nisi quat calamiter. Erasmus ad Dorpium, Theologum. In the rifacimento of the Friend, I have inserted extracts from the Consciens ad Populum, printed, though scarcely published, in the year 1795. In the very heat and height of my anti-ministerial enthusiasm, these in proof that my principles of politics have sustained no change. In the present chapter, I have annexed to my letters from Germany, with particular reference to that, which contains a disquisition on the modern drama, a critique on the tragedy of Bertram, written within the last 12 months, in proof that I have been as falsely charged with any fickleness in my principles of taste. The letter was written to a friend, and the apparent abruptness with which it begins, is owing to the omission of the introductory sentences. You remember, my dear sir, that Mr. Whitbread, shortly before his death, proposed to the assembled subscribers of Drury Lane Theatre, that the concern should be farmed to some responsible individual under certain conditions and limitations, and that his proposal was rejected. Not without indignation, as subversive of the main object, for the attainment of which the enlightened and patriotic assemblage of philodramatists had been induced to risk their subscriptions. Now this object was avowed to be no less than the redemption of the British stage not only from horses, dogs, elephants, and the like zoological rarities, but also from the more pernicious barbarisms and Kotzebuisms in morals and taste. Drury Lane was to be restored to its former classical renown. Shakespeare, Johnson, and Otway, with the expurgated muses of Vanbrugh, Congreve, and Wycherley, were to be re-inaugurated in their rightful dominion over British audiences. And the Herculean process was to commence, by exterminating the speaking monsters imported from the banks of the Danube, compared with which their mute relations, the emigrants from Exeter, Change, and Toledo, late Pidcocks, Showcarts, were tame and inoffensive. Could an heroic project, at once so refined and so arduous, be consistently entrusted to, could its success be rationally expected from, a mercenary manager, at whose critical quarantine the lucri bonus odor would conciliate a bill of health to the plague in person? No. As the work proposed, such must be the workmasters. Rank, fortune, liberal education, and, their natural accompaniments, or consequences, critical discernment, delicate tact, disinterestedness, unsuspected morals, notorious patriotism, and tried mecenaschip. These were the recommendations that influenced the votes of the proprietary subscribers of Drury Lane Theatre, these the motives that occasioned the election of its Supreme Committee of Management. This circumstance alone would have excited a strong interest in the public mind, respecting the first production of the tragic muse which had been announced under such auspices, and had passed the ordeal of such judgments, and the tragedy on which you have requested my judgment, was the work on which the great expectations, justified by so many causes, were doomed at length to settle. But before I enter on the examination of Bertram, or the castle of St. Aldobrand, I shall interpose a few words, on the phrase German drama, which I hold to be altogether a misnomer. At the time of Lessing, the German stage, such as it was, appears to have been a flat and servile copy of the French. It was Lessing who first introduced the name and the works of Shakespeare to the admiration of the Germans. And I should not perhaps go too far, if I add, that it was Lessing who first proved to all thinking men, even to Shakespeare's own countrymen, the true nature of his apparent irregularities. These, he demonstrated, were deviations only from the accidents of the Greek tragedy, and from such accidents as hung a heavy weight on the wings of the Greek poets, and narrowed their flight within the limits of what we may call the heroic opera. He proved, that, in all the essentials of art, no less than in the truth of nature, the plays of Shakespeare were incomparably more coincident with the principles of Aristotle, than the productions of Corneille and Racine. notwithstanding the boasted regularity of the latter. Under these convictions were Lessing's own dramatic works composed. Their deficiency is in depth and imagination, their excellence is in the construction of the plot, the good sense of the sentiments, the sobriety of the morals, and the high polish of the diction and dialogue. In short, his dramas are the very antipodes of all those which it has been the fashion of late years at once to abuse and enjoy, under the name of the German drama. Of this latter, Schiller's Robbers was the earliest specimen, the first fruits of his youth, I had almost said of his boyhood, and as such, the pledge and promise of no ordinary genius. Only as such, did the maturer judgment of the author tolerate the play. During his whole life he expressed himself concerning this production with more than needful asperity, as a monster not less offensive to good taste, than to sound morals. And, in his latter years, his indignation at the unwonted popularity of the Robbers seduced him into the contrary extremes, viz. a studied feebleness of interest, as far as the interest was to be derived from incidents and the excitement of curiosity, a diction elaborately metrical, the affectation of rhymes, and the pedantry of the chorus. But to understand the true character of the Robbers, and of the countless imitations which were its spawn, I must inform you, or at least call to your recollection, that, about that time, and for some years before it, three of the most popular books in the German language were, the translations of Young's Night Thoughts, Hervey's Meditations, and Richardson's Clarissa Harlowe. Now we have only to combine the bloated style and peculiar rhythm of Hervey, which is poetic only on account of its utter unfitness for prose, and might as appropriately be called prosaic, from its utter unfitness for poetry. We have only, I repeat, to combine these Herveyisms with the strained thoughts, the figurative metaphysics and solemn epigrams of Young on the one hand, and with the loaded sensibility, the minute detail, the morbid consciousness of every thought and feeling in the whole flux and reflux of the mind, in short the self-involution and dreamlike continuity of Richardson on the other hand. And then to add the horrific incidents, and mysterious villains, geniuses of supernatural intellect, if you will take the author's words for it, but on a level with the meanest ruffians of the condemned cells. If we are to judge by their actions and contrivances, to add the ruined castles, the dungeons, the trapdoors, the skeletons, the flesh and blood ghosts, and the perpetual moonshine of a modern author. Themselves the literary brood of the Castle of Otranto, the translations of which, with the imitations and improvements aforesaid, were about that time beginning to make as much noise in Germany as their originals were making in England. And as the compound of these ingredients duly mixed, you will recognize the so-called German drama. The olla podrida thus cooked up, was denounced, by the best critics in Germany, as the mere cramps of weakness, and orgasms of a sickly imagination on the part of the author, and the lowest provocation of torpid feeling on that of the readers. The old blunder, however, concerning the irregularity and wildness of Shakespeare, in which the German did but echo the French, who again were but the echoes of our own critics, was still in vogue. And Shakespeare was quoted as authority for the most anti-Shakespearean drama. We have indeed two poets who wrote as one, near the age of Shakespeare, to whom, as the worst characteristic of their writings, the Coryphaeus of the present drama may challenge the honor of being a poor relation, or impoverished descendant. For if we would charitably consent to forget the comic humor, the wit, the felicities of style, in other words, all the poetry, and 9/10 of all the genius of Beaumont and Fletcher, that which would remain becomes a Kotzebue. The so-called German drama, therefore, is English in its origin, English in its materials, and English by readoption. Until we can prove that Kotzebue, or any of the whole breed of Kotzebues, whether dramatists or romantic writers, or writers of romantic dramas, were ever admitted to any other shelf in the libraries of well-educated Germans than were occupied by their originals, and apes in their mother country, we should submit to carry our own brat on our own shoulders. Or rather consider it as a lack-grace returned from transportation with such improvements only in growth and manners as young transported convicts usually come home with. I know nothing that contributes more to a clearer insight into the true nature of any literary phenomenon, than the comparison of it with some elder production, the likeness of which is striking, yet only apparent, while the difference is real. In the present case this opportunity is furnished us, by the old Spanish play, entitled Atheista Fulminado, formerly, and perhaps still, acted in the churches and monasteries of Spain, and which, under various names, Don Juan, the Libertine, etc., has had its day of favor in every country throughout Europe. A popularity so extensive, and of a work so grotesque and extravagant, claims and merits philosophical attention and investigation. The first point to be noticed is, that the play is throughout imaginative. Nothing of it belongs to the real world, but the names of the places and persons. The comic parts, equally with the tragic. The living, equally with the defunct characters, are creatures of the brain. As little amenable to the rules of ordinary probability, as the Satan of Paradise Lost, or the Caliban of the Tempest, and therefore to be understood and judged of as impersonated abstractions. Rank, fortune, wit, talent, acquired knowledge, and liberal accomplishments, with beauty of person, vigorous health, and constitutional hardihood, all these advantages, elevated by the habits and sympathies of noble birth and national character, are supposed to have combined in Don Juan, so as to give him the means of carrying into all its practical consequences the doctrine of a godless nature, as the sole ground and efficient cause not only of all things, events, and appearances, but likewise of all our thoughts, sensations, impulses and actions. Obedience to nature is the only virtue, the gratification of the passions and appetites are only dictate, each individual's self-will the sole organ through which nature utters her commands, and self-contradiction is the only wrong. For, by the laws of spirit, in the right is every individual character that acts in strict consistence with itself. That speculative opinions, however impious and daring they may be, are not always followed by correspondent conduct, is most true, as well as that they can scarcely in any instance be systematically realized, on account of their unsuitableness to human nature and to the institutions of society. It can be hell, only where it is all hell, and a separate world of devils is necessary for the existence of any one complete devil. But on the other hand it is no less clear, nor, with the biography of Carrier and his fellow atheists before us, can it be denied without willful blindness, that the, so-called, system of nature, that is, materialism, with the utter rejection of moral responsibility, of a present providence, and of both present and future retribution, may influence the characters and actions of individuals, and even of communities, to a degree that almost does away the distinction between men and devils, and will make the page of the future historian resemble the narration of a madman's dreams. It is not the wickedness of Don Juan, therefore, which constitutes the character an abstraction, and removes it from the rules of probability, but the rapid succession of the correspondent acts and incidents, his intellectual superiority, and the splendid accumulation of his gifts and desirable qualities, as coexistent with entire wickedness in one and the same person. But this likewise is the very circumstance which gives to this strange play its charm and universal interest. Don Juan is, from beginning to end, an intelligible character, as much so as the Satan of Milton. The poet asks only of the reader, what, as a poet, he is privileged to ask, namely, that sort of negative faith in the existence of such a being, which we willingly give to productions professedly ideal, and a disposition to the same state of feeling, as that with which we contemplate the idealized figures of the Apollo Belvedere, and the Farnese Hercules. What the Hercules is to the eye in corporeal strength, Don Juan is to the mind in strength of character. The ideal consists in the happy balance of the generic with the individual. The former makes the character representative and symbolical, therefore instructive, because, mutatis mutandis, it is applicable to whole classes of men. The latter gives it living interest. For nothing lives or is real, but is definite and individual. To understand this completely, the reader need only recollect the specific state of his feelings, when in looking at a picture of the historic, more properly of the poetic or heroic, class. He objects to a particular figure as being too much of a portrait. And this interruption of his complacency he feels without the least reference to, or the least acquaintance with, any person in real life whom he might recognize in this figure. It is enough that such a figure is not ideal, and therefore not ideal, because one of the two factors or elements of the ideal is in excess. A similar and more powerful objection he would feel towards a set of figures which were mere abstractions, like those of Cipriani, and what have been called Greek forms and faces, that is, outlines drawn according to a recipe. These again are not ideal, because in these the other element is in excess. Forma formans per formam formatam translucens, is the definition and perfection of ideal art. This excellence is so happily achieved in the Don Juan, that it is capable of interesting without poetry, nay, even without words, as in our pantomime of that name. We see clearly how the character is formed. And the very extravagance of the incidents, and the superhuman entireness of Don Juan's agency, prevents the wickedness from shocking our minds to any painful degree. We do not believe it enough for this effect. No, not even with that kind of temporary and negative belief or acquiescence which I have described above. Meantime the qualities of his character are too desirable, too flattering to our pride and our wishes, not to make up on this side as much additional faith as was lost on the other. There is no danger, thinks the spectator or reader, of my becoming such a monster of iniquity as Don Juan. I never shall be an atheist. I shall never disallow all distinction between right and wrong. I have not the least inclination to be so outrageous a drawcancer in my love affairs. But to possess such a power of captivating and enchanting the affections of the other sex. To be capable of inspiring in a charming and even a virtuous woman, a love so deep, and so entirely personal to me, that even my worst vices, if I were vicious, even my cruelty and perfidy, if I were cruel and perfidious, could not eradicate the passion. To be so loved for my own self, that even with a distinct knowledge of my character, she yet died to save me, this, sir, takes hold of two sides of our nature, the better and the worse. For the heroic disinterestedness, to which love can transport a woman, cannot be contemplated without an honorable emotion of reverence towards womanhood, and, on the other hand, it is among the miseries, and abides in the dark groundwork of our nature, to crave an outward confirmation of that something within us, which is our very self, that something, not made up of our qualities and relations, but itself the supporter and substantial basis of all these. Love me, and not my qualities, may be a vicious and an insane wish, but it is not a wish wholly without a meaning. Without power, virtue would be insufficient and incapable of revealing its being. It would resemble the magic transformation of Tasso's heroine into a tree, in which she could only groan and bleed. Hence power is necessarily an object of our desire and of our admiration. But of all power, that of the mind is, on every account, the grand desideratum of human ambition. We shall be as gods in knowledge, was and must have been the first temptation, and the coexistence of great intellectual lordship with guilt has never been adequately represented without exciting the strongest interest, and for this reason. That in this bad and heterogeneous coordination we can contemplate the intellect of man more exclusively as a separate self-subsistence, than in its proper state of subordination to his own conscience, or to the will of an infinitely superior being. This is the sacred charm of Shakespeare's male characters in general. They are all cast in the mold of Shakespeare's own gigantic intellect, and this is the open attraction of his Richard, Iago, Edmund, and others in particular. But again, of all intellectual power, that of superiority to the fear of the invisible world is the most dazzling. Its influence is abundantly proved by the one circumstance, that it can bribe us into a voluntary submission of our better knowledge, into suspension of all our judgment derived from constant experience, and enable us to peruse with the liveliest interest the wildest tales of ghosts, wizards, genii, and secret talismans. On this propensity, so deeply rooted in our nature, a specific dramatic probability may be raised by a true poet, if the whole of his work be in harmony, a dramatic probability, sufficient for dramatic pleasure, even when the component characters and incidents border on impossibility. The poet does not require us to be awake and believe, he solicits us only to yield ourselves to a dream. And this too with our eyes open, and with our judgment perdue behind the curtain, ready to awaken us at the first motion of our will, and meantime, only, not to disbelieve. And in such a state of mind, who but must be impressed with the cool intrepidity of Don John on the appearance of his father's ghost. Ghost. Monster. Behold these wounds. D. John. I do. They were well meant and well performed, I see. Ghost. Repent, repent of all thy villainies. My clamorous blood to heaven for vengeance cries. Heaven will pour out his judgments on you all. Hell gapes for you each fiend doth call. And hourly waits your unrepenting fall. You with eternal horrors they'll torment. Except of all your crimes you suddenly repent. Ghost sinks. D. John. Farewell, thou art a foolish ghost. Repent, quoth he. What could this mean? Our senses are all in a mist sure. D. Antonio. One of D. Juan's reprobate companions. They are not. 'Twas a ghost. D. Lopez. Another reprobate. I ne'er believed those foolish tales before. D. John. Come. 'Tis no matter. Let it be what it will, it must be natural. D. Ant. And nature is unalterable in us too. D. John. 'Tis true. The nature of a ghost cannot change ours. Who also can deny a portion of sublimity to the tremendous consistency with which he stands out the last fearful trial, like a second Prometheus? Chorus of devils. Statue ghost. Will you not relent and feel remorse? D. John. Couldst thou bestow another heart on me I might. But with this heart I have, I cannot. D. Lopez. These things are prodigious. D. Anton. I have a sort of grudging to relent, but something holds me back. D. Lop. If we could, 'tis now too late. I will not. D. Int. We defy thee. Ghost. Perish ye impious wretches, go and find the punishments laid up in store for you. Thunder and lightning. D. Lop. And D. Ant are swallowed up. Ghost to D. John. Behold their dreadful fates, and know that thy last moments come. D. John. Think not to fright me, foolish ghost, I'll break your marble body in pieces and pull down your horse. Thunder and lightning, chorus of devils, etc. D. John. These things I see with wonder, but no fear. Were all the elements to be confounded and shuffled all into their former chaos. Were seas of sulphur flaming round about me, and all mankind roaring within those fires, I could not fear, or feel the least remorse. To the last instant I would dare thy power. Here I stand firm, and all thy threats contemn. Thy murderer, to the ghost of one whom he had murdered, stands here. Now do thy worst. He is swallowed up in a cloud of fire. In fine, the character of Don John consists in the union of everything desirable to human nature, as means, and which therefore by the well-known law of association becomes at length desirable on their own account. On their own account, and, in their own dignity, they are here displayed, as being employed to ends so unhuman, that in the effect, they appear almost as means without an end. The ingredients too are mixed in the happiest proportion, so as to uphold and relieve each other, more especially in that constant interpoise of wit, gaiety, and social generosity, which prevents the criminal, even in his most atrocious moments, from sinking into the mere ruffian, as far at least, as our imagination sits in judgment. Above all, the fine suffusion through the whole, with the characteristic manners and feelings, of a highly bred gentleman gives life to the drama. Thus having invited the statue ghost of the governor, whom he had murdered, to supper, which invitation the marble ghost accepted by a nod of the head, Don John has prepared a banquet. D. John. Some wine, sirrah. Here's to Don Pedro's ghost, he should have been welcome. D. Lop. The rascal is afraid of you after death. One knocks hard at the door. D. John. To the servant, rise and do your duty. Serve. Oh the devil, the devil. Marble ghost enters. D. John. Ha, 'tis the ghost. Let's rise and receive him. Come. Governor, you are welcome, sit there, if we had thought you would have come, we would have stayed for you. Here, Governor, your health. Friends, put it about. Here's excellent meat, taste of this ragout. Come, I'll help you, come. Eat, and let old quarrels be forgotten. The ghost threatens him with vengeance. D. John. We are too much confirmed, curse on this dry discourse. Come, here's to your mistress, you had one when you were living. Not forgetting your sweet sister. Devils enter. D. John. Are these some of your retinue? Devils, say you? I'm sorry I have no burnt brandy to treat them with, that's drink fit for devils, etc. Nor is the scene from which we quote interesting, in dramatic probability alone, it is susceptible likewise of a sound moral. Of a moral that has more than common claims on the notice of a too numerous class, who are ready to receive the qualities of gentlemanly courage and scrupulous honor, in all the recognized laws of honor, as the substitutes of virtue, instead of its ornaments. This, indeed, is the moral value of the play at large, and that which places it at a world's distance from the spirit of modern Jacobinism. The latter introduces to us clumsy copies of these showy instrumental qualities, in order to reconcile us to vice and want of principle. While the Atheista Fulminato presents an exquisite portraiture of the same qualities, in all their gloss and glow, but presents them for the sole purpose of displaying their hollowness. And in order to put us on our guard by demonstrating their utter indifference to vice and virtue, whenever these and the like accomplishments are contemplated for themselves alone. 18 years ago I observed, that the whole secret of the modern Jacobinical drama, which, and not the German, is its appropriate designation, and of all its popularity, consists in the confusion and subversion of the natural order of things in their causes and effects, namely, in the excitement of surprise by representing the qualities of liberality, refined feeling, and a nice sense of honor, those things rather which pass amongst us for such, in persons and in classes where experience teaches us least to expect them. And by rewarding with all the sympathies which are the due of virtue, those criminals whom law, reason, and religion have excommunicated from our esteem. This of itself would lead me back to Bertram, or the castle of St. Aldobrand. But, in my own mind, this tragedy was brought into connection with the libertine, Shadwell's adaptation of the Atheista Fulminato to the English stage in the reign of Charles II, by the fact, that our modern drama is taken, in the substance of it, from the first scene of the third act of the libertine. But with what palpable superiority of judgment in the original. Earth and hell, men and spirits are up in arms against Don John. The two former acts of the play have not only prepared us for the supernatural, but accustomed us to the prodigious. It is, therefore, neither more nor less than we anticipate when the captain exclaims, "In all the dangers I have been, such horrors I never knew. I am quite unmanned," and when the hermit says, that he had beheld the ocean in wildest rage, yet ne'er before saw a storm so dreadful, such horrid flashes of lightning, and such claps of thunder, were never in my remembrance. And Don John's burst of startling impiety is equally intelligible in its motive, as dramatic in its effect. But what is there to account for the prodigy of the tempest at Bertram's shipwreck? It is a mere supernatural effect, without even a hint of any supernatural agency, a prodigy, without any circumstance mentioned that is prodigious, and a miracle introduced without a ground, and ending without a result. Every event and every scene of the play might have taken place as well if Bertram and his vessel had been driven in by a common hard gale, or from want of provisions. The first act would have indeed lost its greatest and most sonorous picture. A scene for the sake of a scene, without a word spoken, as such, therefore, a rarity without a precedent, we must take it, and be thankful. In the opinion of not a few, it was, in every sense of the word, the best scene in the play. I am quite certain it was the most innocent, and the steady, quiet uprightness of the flame of the wax candles, which the monks held over the roaring billows amid the storm of wind and rain, was really miraculous. The Sicilian sea coast, a convent of monks, night, a most portentous, unearthly storm, a vessel is wrecked contrary to all human expectation, one man saves himself by his prodigious powers as a swimmer. Aided by the peculiarity of his destination. Prior. All did perish. First monk. Change those drenched weeds. Prior. I wist not of them, every soul did perish. Enter third monk hastily. Third monk. No, there was one did battle with the storm. With careless desperate force. Full many times. His life was won and lost, as though he recked not. No hand did aid him, and he aided none. Alone he breasted the broad wave, alone. That man was saved. Well. This man is led in by the monks, supposed dripping wet, and to very natural inquiries he either remains silent, or gives most brief and surly answers, and after 3 or 4 of these half-line courtesies, dashing off the monks, who had saved him, he exclaims in the true sublimity of our modern misanthropic heroism. Off. Ye are men, there's poison in your touch. But I must yield, for this, what, hath left me strengthless. So end the 3 first scenes. In the next, the castle of St. Aldobrand, we find the servants there equally frightened with this unearthly storm, though wherein it differed from other violent storms we are not told, except that Hugo informs us, page 9. Pete. Hugo, well met. Does e'en thy age bear memory of so terrible a storm? Hugo. They have been frequent lately. Pete. They are ever so in Sicily. Hugo. So it is said. But storms when I was young would still pass o'er like nature's fitful fevers, and rendered all more wholesome. Now their rage, sent thus unseasonable and profitless, speaks like the threats of heaven. A most perplexing theory of Sicilian storms is this of old Hugo. And what is very remarkable, not apparently founded on any great familiarity of his own with this troublesome article. For when Pietro asserts the ever more frequency of tempests in Sicily, the old man professes to know nothing more of the fact, but by hearsay. So it is said. But why he assumed this storm to be unseasonable, and on what he grounded his prophecy, for the storm is still in full fury, that it would be profitless. And without the physical powers common to all other violent sea winds in purifying the atmosphere, we are left in the dark. As well concerning the particular points in which he knew it, during its continuance, to differ from those that he had been acquainted with in his youth. We are at length introduced to the Lady Imogene, who, we learn, had not rested, through the night, not on account of the tempest, for long ere the storm arose, her restless gestures forbade all hope to see her blessed with sleep. Sitting at a table, and looking at a portrait, she informs us, first, that portrait painters may make a portrait from memory. The limner's art may trace the absent feature. For surely these words could never mean, that a painter may have a person sit to him who afterwards may leave the room or perhaps the country. Secondly, that a portrait painter can enable a mourning lady to possess a good likeness of her absent lover, but that the portrait painter cannot, and who shall restore the scenes in which they met and parted. The natural answer would have been, why the scene painter to be sure. But this unreasonable lady requires in addition sundry things to be painted that have neither lines nor colors. The thoughts, the recollections, sweet and bitter. Or the Elysian dreams of lovers when they loved. Which last sentence must be supposed to mean, when they were present, and making love to each other. Then, if this portrait could speak, it would acquit the faith of womankind. How? Had she remained constant? No, she has been married to another man, whose wife she now is. How then? Why, that, in spite of her marriage vow, she had continued to yearn and crave for her former lover. This has her body, that her mind. Which has the better bargain? The lover, however, was not contented with this precious arrangement, as we shall soon find. The lady proceeds to inform us that during the many years of their separation, there have happened in the different parts of the world, a number of such things. Even such, as in a course of years always have, and till the millennium, doubtless always will happen somewhere or other. Yet this passage, both in language and in metre, is perhaps amongst the best parts of the play. The lady's love companion and most esteemed attendant, Clotilda, now enters and explains this love and esteem by proving herself a most passive and dispassionate listener, as well as a brief and lucky querist, who asks by chance questions that we should have thought made for the very sake of the answers. In short, she very much reminds us of those puppet heroines, for whom the showman contrives to dialogue without any skill in ventriloquism. This, notwithstanding, is the best scene in the play, and though crowded with solecisms, corrupt diction, and offences against metre, would possess merit sufficient to outweigh them, if we could suspend the moral sense during the perusal. It tells well and passionately the preliminary circumstances, and thus overcomes the main difficulty of most first acts, to wit, that of retrospective narration. It tells us of her having been honourably addressed by a noble youth, of rank and fortune vastly superior to her own, of their mutual love, heightened on her part by gratitude, of his loss of his sovereign's favour, his disgrace, attainder, and flight, that he, thus degraded, sank into a vile ruffian, the chieftain of a murderous banditti. And that from the habitual indulgence of the most reprobate habits and ferocious passions, he had become so changed, even in appearance, and features, that she who bore him had recoiled from him, nor known the alien visage of her child. Yet still she, Imogen, loved him. She is compelled by the silent entreaties of a father, perishing with bitter shameful want on the cold earth, to give her hand, with a heart thus irrecoverably pre-engaged, to Lord Aldobrand, the enemy of her lover. Even to the very man who had baffled his ambitious schemes, and was, at the present time, entrusted with the execution of the sentence of death which had been passed on Bertram. Now, the proof of woman's love, so industriously held forth for the sympathy, if not for the esteem of the audience, consists in this, that, though Bertram had become a robber and a murderer by trade, a ruffian in manners, with form and features at which his own mother could not but recoil, yet she, Lady Imogen, the wife of a most noble, honoured lord, estimable as a man, exemplary and affectionate as a husband, and the fond father of her only child, that she, notwithstanding all this, striking her heart, dares to say to it, "But thou art Bertram still, and Bertram's ever." A monk now enters, and entreats in his prior's name for the wonted hospitality, and free noble usage, of the castle of St. Aldobrand for some wretched shipwrecked souls, and from this we learn, for the first time, to our infinite surprise, that notwithstanding the supernaturalness of the storm aforesaid, not only Bertram, but the whole of his gang, had been saved. By what means we are left to conjecture, and can only conclude that they had all the same desperate swimming powers, and the same saving destiny as the hero, Bertram himself. So ends the first act, and with it the tale of the events, both those with which the tragedy begins, and those which had occurred previous to the date of its commencement. The second displays Bertram in disturbed sleep, which the prior, who hangs over him, prefers calling a starting trance, and with a strained voice, that would have awakened one of the 7 sleepers, observes to the audience, "How the lip works! How the bare teeth do grind! And beaded drops course down his written brow." The dramatic effect of which passage we not only concede to the admirers of this tragedy, but acknowledge the further advantages of preparing the audience for the most surprising series of wry faces, proflated mouths, and lunatic gestures that were ever launched on an audience to sear the sense. Prior. I will awake him from this horrid trance. This is no natural sleep. Ho, wake thee, stranger. This is rather a whimsical application of the verb reflex, we must confess, though we remember a similar transfer of the agent to the patient in a manuscript tragedy, in which the Bertram of the piece, prostrating a man with a single blow of his fist, exclaims, "Knock me thee down, then ask thee if thou livest." Well, the stranger obeys, and whatever his sleep might have been, his waking was perfectly natural, for lethargy itself could not withstand the scolding stentorship of Mr. Holland, the prior. We next learn from the best authority, his own confession, that the misanthropic hero, whose destiny was incompatible with drowning, is Count Bertram, who not only reveals his past fortunes, but avows with open atrocity his satanic hatred of Imogene's lord, and his frantic thirst of revenge. And so the raving character raves, and the scolding character scolds, and what else? Does not the prior act? Does he not send for a posse of constables or thief-takers to handcuff the villain, or take him either to Bedlam or Newgate? Nothing of the kind. The author preserves the unity of character, and the scolding prior from first to last does nothing but scold, with the exception indeed of the last scene of the last act, in which, with a most surprising revolution, he whines, weeps, and kneels to the condemned blaspheming assassin out of pure affection to the high-hearted man, the sublimity of whose angel sin rivals the star-bright apostate, that is, who was as proud as Lucifer, and as wicked as the devil, and had thrilled him, Prior Holland aforesaid, with wild admiration. Accordingly in the very next scene, we have this tragic Macheath, with his whole gang, in the castle of St. Aldobrand, without any attempt on the prior's part either to prevent him, or to put the mistress and servants of the castle on their guard against their new inmates. Though he, the prior, knew, and confesses that he knew, that Bertram's fearful mates were assassins so habituated and naturalized to guilt, that when their drenched hold forsook both gold and gear, they griped their daggers with a murderer's instinct. And though he also knew, that Bertram was the leader of a band whose trade was blood. To the castle however he goes, thus with the holy prior's consent, if not with his assistance, and thither let us follow him. No sooner is our hero safely housed in the castle of St. Aldobrand, than he attracts the notice of the lady and her confidant, by his wild and terrible dark eyes, muffled form, fearful form, darkly wild, proudly stern, and the like commonplace indefinites, seasoned by merely verbal antitheses. And at best, copied with very slight change, from the Conrade of Southey's Joan of Arc. The Lady Imogen, who has been, as is the case, she tells us, with all soft and solemn spirits, worshipping the moon on a terrace or rampart within view of the castle, insists on having an interview with our hero, and this too tete-a-tete. Would the reader learn why and wherefore the confidant is excluded, who very properly remonstrates against such conference, alone, at night, with one who bears such fearful form, the reason follows, why, therefore send him. I say, follows, because the next line, all things of fear have lost their power over me, is separated from the former by a break or pause, and besides that it is a very poor answer to the danger. Is no answer at all to the gross indelicacy of this wilful exposure. We must therefore regard it as a mere afterthought, that a little softens the rudeness, but adds nothing to the weight, of that exquisite woman's reason aforesaid. And so exit Clotilda and enter Bertram, who stands without looking at her, that is, with his lower limbs forked, his arms akimbo, his side to the lady's front, the whole figure resembling an inverted Y. He is soon however roused from the state surly to the state frantic, and then follow raving, yelling, cursing, she fainting, he relenting, in runs Imogene's child, squeaks, mother. He snatches it up, and with a, God bless thee, child. Bertram has kissed thy child, the curtain drops. The third act is short, and short be our account of it. It introduces Lord St. Aldobrand on his road homeward, and next Imogen in the convent, confessing the foulness of her heart to the prior, who first indulges his old humour with a fit of senseless scolding, then leaves her alone with her ruffian paramour, with whom she makes at once an infamous appointment, and the curtain drops, that it may be carried into act and consummation. I want words to describe the mingled horror and disgust with which I witnessed the opening of the fourth act, considering it as a melancholy proof of the depravation of the public mind. The shocking spirit of Jacobinism seemed no longer confined to politics. The familiarity with atrocious events and characters appeared to have poisoned the taste, even where it had not directly disorganized the moral principles, and left the feelings callous to all the mild appeals, and craving alone for the grossest and most outrageous stimulants. The very fact then present to our senses, that a British audience could remain passive under such an insult to common decency, nay, receive with a thunder of applause. A human being supposed to have come reeking from the consummation of this complex foulness and baseness, these and the like reflections so pressed as with the weight of lead upon my heart, that actor, author, and tragedy would have been forgotten. Had it not been for a plain elderly man sitting beside me, who, with a very serious face, that at once expressed surprise and aversion, touched my elbow, and, pointing to the actor, said to me in a half-whisper, "Do you see that little fellow there? He has just been committing adultery." Somewhat relieved by the laugh which this droll address occasioned, I forced back my attention to the stage sufficiently to learn, that Bertram is recovered from a transient fit of remorse by the information, that St. Aldobrand was commissioned, to do, what every honest man must have done without commission, if he did his duty, to seize him and deliver him to the just vengeance of the law. An information which, as he had long known himself to be an attainted traitor and proclaimed outlaw, and not only a traitor in blood himself, but notoriously the captain of a gang of thieves, pirates, and assassins, assuredly could not have been new to him. It is this, however, which alone and instantly restores him to his accustomed state of raving, blasphemy, and nonsense. Next follows Imogene's constrained interview with her injured husband, and his sudden departure again, all in love and kindness, in order to attend the feast of St. Anselm at the convent. This was, it must be owned, a very strange engagement for so tender a husband to make within a few minutes after so long an absence. But first his lady has told him that she has a vow on her, and wishes that black perdition may gulf her perjured soul. Note, she is lying at the very time, if she ascends his bed, till her penance is accomplished. How, therefore, is the poor husband to amuse himself in this interval of her penance? But do not be distressed, reader, on account of the St. Aldobrand's absence. As the author has contrived to send him out of the house, when a husband would be in his, and the lover's way, so he will doubtless not be at a loss to bring him back again as soon as he is wanted. Well, the husband gone in on the one side, out pops the lover from the other, and for the fiendish purpose of harrowing up the soul of his wretched accomplice in guilt, by announcing to her, with most brutal and blasphemous execrations, his fixed and deliberate resolve to assassinate her husband. All this too is for no discoverable purpose on the part of the author, but that of introducing a series of super-tragic starts, pauses, screams, struggling, dagger-throwing, falling on the ground, starting up again wildly, swearing, outcries for help, falling again on the ground, rising again, faintly tottering towards the door, and, to end the scene, a most convenient fainting fit of Our Lady's, just in time to give Bertram an opportunity of seeking the object of his hatred, before she alarms the house, which indeed she has had full time to have done before, but that the author rather chose she should amuse herself and the audience by the above-described ravings and startings. She recovers slowly, and to her enter, Clotilda, the confidante and mother-confessor. Then commences, what in theatrical language is called the madness, but which the author more accurately entitles, delirium, it appearing indeed a sort of intermittent fever with fits of lightheadedness off and on, whenever occasion and stage effect happen to call for it. A convenient return of the storm, we told the reader beforehand how it would be, had changed the rivulet, that bathed the convent walls, into a foaming flood, upon its brink. The Lord and his small train do stand appalled, with torch and bell from their high battlements. The monks do summon to the pass in vain. He must return tonight. Talk of the devil, and his horns appear, says the proverb, and sure enough, within 10 lines of the exit of the messenger, sent to stop him, the arrival of Lord St. Aldobrand is announced. Bertram's ruffian band now enter, and range themselves across the stage, giving fresh cause for Imogene's screams and madness. St. Aldobrand, having received his mortal wound behind the scenes, totters in to welter in his blood, and to die at the feet of this double-damned adulteress. Of her, as far as she is concerned in this fourth act, we have 2 additional points to notice. First, the low cunning and Jesuitical trick with which she deludes her husband into words of forgiveness, which he himself does not understand. And secondly, that everywhere she is made the object of interest and sympathy, and it is not the author's fault, if, at any moment, she excites feelings less gentle than those we are accustomed to associate with the self-accusations of a sincere religious penitent. And did a British audience endure all this, they received it with plaudits, which, but for the rivalry of the carts and hackney coaches, might have disturbed the evening prayers of the scanty week-day congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral. Tempora mutantur, nocete mutamur in illis. Of the fifth act, the only thing noticeable, for rant and nonsense, though abundant as ever, have long before the last act become things of course, is the profane representation of the high altar in a chapel, with all the vessels and other preparations for the Holy Sacrament. A hymn is actually sung on the stage by the chorister boys. For the rest, Imogen, who now and then talks deliriously, but who is always light-headed as far as her gown and hair can make her so, wanders about in dark woods with cavern rocks and precipices in the back scene. And a number of mute dramatis personae move in and out continually, for whose presence, there is always at least this reason, that they afford something to be seen by that very large part of a Drury Lane audience who have small chance of hearing a word. She had, it appears, taken her child with her, but what becomes of the child, whether she murdered it or not, nobody can tell, nobody can learn. It was a riddle at the representation, and after a most attentive perusal of the play, a riddle it remains. No more I know, I wish I did. And I would tell it all to you. For what became of this poor child? There's none that ever knew. Our whole information is derived from the following words. Prior, where is thy child? Clodagh, pointing to the cavern into which she has looked. Oh, he lies cold within his cavern tomb. Why dost thou urge her with the horrid theme? Prior. Who will not, the reader may observe, be disappointed of his dose of scolding. It was to make, query wake, one living chord heart. And I will try, though, my own breaks at it. Where is thy child? I am Og. With a frantic laugh, the forest fiend hath snatched him. He, who? The fiend or the child? Rides the nightmare through the wizard woods. Now these two lines consist in a senseless plagiarism from the counterfeited madness of Edgar in Lear, who, in imitation of the gypsy incantations, puns on the old word mare, a hag. And the no less senseless adoption of Dryden's forest fiend, and the wizard stream by which Milton, in his Lycidas, so finely characterizes the spreading deva, fabulosus amnis. Observe too these images stand unique in the speeches of Imogen, without the slightest resemblance to anything she says before or after. But we are weary. The characters in this act frisk about, here, there, and everywhere, as teasingly as the jack-o'-lantern lights which mischievous boys, from across a narrow street, throw with a looking-glass on the faces of their opposite neighbors. Bertram disarmed, outroding Charles de Moor in The Robbers, befaces the collected knights of St. Anselm, all in complete armor, and so, by pure dint of black looks, he outdares them into passive poltroons. The sudden revolution in the prior's manners we have before noticed, and it is indeed so outré, that a number of the audience imagined a great secret was to come out, viz. that the prior was one of the many instances of a youthful sinner metamorphosed into an old scold, and that this Bertram would appear at last to be his son. Imogen reappears at the convent, and dies of her own accord. Bertram stabs himself, and dies by her side, and that the play may conclude as it began, to wit, in a superfetation of blasphemy upon nonsense, because he had snatched a sword from a despicable coward, who retreats in terror when it is pointed towards him in sport. This fellow d'se, and thief captain, this loathsome and leprous confluence of robbery, adultery, murder, and cowardly assassination, this monster, whose best deed is, the having saved his betters from the degradation of hanging him, by turning Jack Ketch to himself. First recommends the charitable monks and holy prior to pray for his soul, and then has the folly and impudence to exclaim, I die no felon's death. A warrior's weapon freed a warrior's soul. Chapter 24. Conclusion. It sometimes happens that we are punished for our faults by incidents, in the causation of which these faults had no share, and this I have always felt the severest punishment. The wound indeed is of the same dimensions, but the edges are jagged, and there is a dull under pain that survives the smart which it had aggravated. For there is always a consolatory feeling that accompanies the sense of a proportion between antecedents and consequents. The sense of before and after becomes both intelligible and intellectual when, and only when, we contemplate the succession in the relations of cause and effect, which, like the two poles of the magnet, manifest the being and unity of the one power by relative opposites, and give, as it were, a substratum of permanence, of identity, and therefore of reality, to the shadowy flux of time. It is eternity revealing itself in the phenomena of time, and the perception and acknowledgement of the proportionality and appropriateness of the present to the past, prove to the afflicted soul that it has not yet been deprived of the sight of God, that it can still recognize the effective presence of a Father, though through a darkened glass and a turbid atmosphere, though of a Father that is chastising it. And for this cause, doubtless, are we so framed in mind, and even so organized in brain and nerve, that all confusion is painful. It is within the experience of many medical practitioners, that a patient, with strange and unusual symptoms of disease, has been more distressed in mind, more wretched, from the fact of being unintelligible to himself and others, than from the pain or danger of the disease, nay, that the patient has received the most solid comfort, and resumed a genial and enduring cheerfulness, from some new symptom or product that had at once determined the name and nature of his complaint, and rendered it an intelligible effect of an intelligible cause, even though the discovery did at the same moment preclude all hope of restoration. Hence the mystic theologians, whose delusions we may more confidently hope to separate from their actual intuitions, when we condescend to read their works without the presumption that whatever our fancy, always the ape, and too often the adulterator and counterfeit of our memory, has not made or cannot make a picture of, must be nonsense. Hence, I say, the mystics have joined in representing the state of the reprobate spirits as a dreadful dream in which there is no sense of reality, not even of the pangs they are enduring, an eternity without time, and as it were below it, God present without manifestation of his presence. But these are depths which we dare not linger over. Let us turn to an instance more on a level with the ordinary sympathies of mankind. Here then, and in this same healing influence of light and distinct beholding, we may detect the final cause of that instinct which, in the great majority of instances, leads, and almost compels the afflicted to communicate their sorrows. Hence too flows the alleviation that results from opening out our griefs, which are thus presented in distinguishable forms instead of the mist, through which whatever is shapeless becomes magnified and, literally, enormous. Casimir, in the 5th ode of his 3rd book, has happily expressed this thought. Mi longus silendi. Edit amor, faciles gluctus. Hausit medullas. Fugerit osseus. Simul negantem visir jusseries. Oras amicarum, iti loquacem. Questibus evacuaris iram. Olim querendo decinimus quiri. Ipsoque fleta lacrima perditor. Nec fortis ec, si per omnes. Cura volet residet gramos. Vires amicis perdit in oribus. Minor que semper dividitur dolor. Per multa permissis vagari. Pectora. I shall not make this an excuse, however, for troubling my readers with any complaints or explanations, with which, as readers, they have little or no concern. It may suffice, for the present at least, to declare, that the causes that have delayed the publication of these volumes for so long a period after they had been printed off, were not connected with any neglect of my own, and that they would form an instructive comment on the chapter concerning authorship as a trade, addressed to young men of genius in the 1st volume of this work. I remember the ludicrous effect produced on my mind by the fast sentence of an autobiography, which, happily for the writer, was as meager in incidents as it is well possible for the life of an individual to be, the eventful life which I am about to record, from the hour in which I rose into existence on this planet, etc. Yet when, notwithstanding this warning example of self-importance before me, I review my own life, I cannot refrain from applying the same epithet to it, and with more than ordinary emphasis, and no private feeling, that affected myself only, should prevent me from publishing the same, for write it I assuredly shall, should life and leisure be granted me, if continued reflection should strengthen my present belief. That my history would add its contingent to the enforcement of one important truth, to wit, that we must not only love our neighbors as ourselves, but ourselves likewise as our neighbors. And that we can do neither unless we love God above both. Who lives, that's not depraved or depraves. Who dies, that bears not one spurn to the grave of their friend's gift. Strange as the delusion may appear, yet it is most true, that 3 years ago I did not know or believe that I had an enemy in the world, and now even my strongest sensations of gratitude are mingled with fear. And I reproach myself for being too often disposed to ask, have I one friend? During the many years which intervened between the composition and the publication of the CHRSTBL, it became almost as well known among literary men as if it had been on common sale. The same references were made to it, and the same liberties taken with it, even to the very names of the imaginary persons in the poem. From almost all of our most celebrated poets, and from some with whom I had no personal acquaintance, I either received or heard of expressions of admiration that, I can truly say, appeared to myself utterly disproportionate to a work that pretended to be nothing more than a common fairy tale. Many, who had allowed no merit to my other poems, whether printed or manuscript, and who have frankly told me as much, uniformly made an exception in favor of the Christabel and the poem entitled Love. Year after year, and in societies of the most different kinds, I had been entreated to recite it, and the result was still the same in all. And altogether different in this respect from the effect produced by the occasional recitation of any other poems I had composed. This before the publication. And since then, with very few exceptions, I have heard nothing but abuse, and this too in a spirit of bitterness at least as disproportionate to the pretensions of the poem, had it been the most pitiably below mediocrity, as the previous eulogies. And far more inexplicable. This may serve as a warning to authors, that in their calculations on the probable reception of a poem, they must subtract to a large amount from the panegyric, which may have encouraged them to publish it. However unsuspicious and however various the sources of this panegyric may have been. And, first, allowances must be made for private enmity, of the very existence of which they had perhaps entertained no suspicion, for personal enmity behind the mask of anonymous criticism. Secondly, for the necessity of a certain proportion of abuse and ridicule in a review, in order to make it saleable. In consequence of which, if they have no friends behind the scenes, the chance must needs be against them. But lastly and chiefly, for the excitement and temporary sympathy of feeling, which the recitation of the poem by an admirer, especially if he be at once a warm admirer and a man of acknowledged celebrity, calls forth in the audience. For this is really a species of animal magnetism, in which the enkindling reciter, by perpetual comment of looks and tones, lends his own will and apprehensive faculty to his auditors. They live for the time within the dilated sphere of his intellectual being. It is equally possible, though not equally common, that a reader left to himself should sink below the poem, as that the poem left to itself should flag beneath the feelings of the reader. But, in my own instance, I had the additional misfortune of having been gossiped about, as devoted to metaphysics, and worse than all, to a system incomparably nearer to the visionary flights of Plato, and even to the jargon of the mystics, than to the established tenets of Locke. Whatever therefore appeared with my name was condemned beforehand, as predestined metaphysics. In a dramatic poem, which had been submitted by me to a gentleman of great influence in the theatrical world, occurred the following passage. Oh, we are querulous creatures. Little less than all things can suffice to make us happy. And little more than nothing is enough to make us wretched. Aye, here now, exclaimed the critic, here come Coleridge's metaphysics. And the very same motive, that is, not that the lines were unfit for the present state of our immense theatres, but that they were metaphysics, was assigned elsewhere for the rejection of the two following passages. The first is spoken in answer to a usurper, who had rested his plea on the circumstance, that he had been chosen by the acclamations of the people. What people? How convened? Or, if convened, must not the magic power that charms together millions of men in council, needs have power to win or wield them? Rather, O far rather, shout forth thy titles to yon circling mountains, and with 1,000-fold reverberation, make the rocks flatter thee, and the volleying air, unbribed, shout back to thee, King Emmerich, by wholesome laws to embank the sovereign power, to deepen by restraint, and by prevention, of lawless will to amass and guide the flood. In its majestic channel, is man's task, and the true patriot's glory. In all else, men safelier trust to heaven, than to themselves. When least themselves, even in those whirling crowds, where folly is contagious, and too oft, even wise men leave their better sense at home, to chide and wonder at them, when returned. The second passage is in the mouth of an old and experienced courtier, betrayed by the man in whom he had most trusted. And yet Sarolta, simple, inexperienced, could see him as he was, and often warned me. Whence learned she this? Oh, she was innocent. And to be innocent is nature's wisdom. The fledged-dove knows the prowlers of the air, feared soon as seen, and flutters back to shelter. And the young steed recoils upon his haunches. The never-yet-seen adders his first heard. Oh, surer than suspicion's 100 eyes is that fine sense, which to the pure in heart, by mere repugnancy of their own goodness, reveals the approach of evil. As therefore my character as a writer could not easily be more injured by an overt act than it was already in consequence of the report, I published a work, a large portion of which was professedly metaphysical. A long delay occurred between its first enunciation and its appearance. It was reviewed therefore by anticipation with a malignity, so avowedly and exclusively personal, as is, I believe, unprecedented even in the present contempt of all common humanity that disgraces and endangers the liberty of the press. After its appearance, the author of this lampoon undertook to review it in the Edinburgh Review. And under the single condition, that he should have written what he himself really thought, and have criticized the work as he would have done had its author been indifferent to him, I should have chosen that man myself. Both from the vigor and the originality of his mind, and from his particular acuteness in speculative reasoning, before all others. I remembered Catullus's lines. Design de quoquam quicquam bene vel moreri. Aut alicum fieri posse putar piam. Omnia sunt ingrata, nihil facis benign est. Imo, etiam te det obest magus. Ut mihi, quem nemo gravius nec acerbius urgit. Quam modo comi unum ac unicum amicum habuit. But I can truly say, that the grief with which I read this rhapsody of predetermined insult, had the rhapsodist himself for its whole and sole object. I refer to this review at present, in consequence of information having been given me, that the innuendo of my potential infidelity, grounded on one passage of my first lay sermon, has been received and propagated with a degree of credence, of which I can safely acquit the originator of the calumny. I give the sentences, as they stand in the sermon, premising only that I was speaking exclusively of miracles worked for the outward senses of men. It was only to overthrow the usurpation exercised in and through the senses, that the senses were miraculously appealed to. Reason and religion are their own evidence. The natural sun is in this respect a symbol of the spiritual. Ere he is fully arisen, and while his glories are still under veil, he calls up the breeze to chase away the usurping vapors of the night season. And thus converts the air itself into the minister of its own purification, not surely in proof or elucidation of the light from heaven, but to prevent its interception. Wherever, therefore, similar circumstances coexist with the same moral causes, the principles revealed, and the examples recorded, in the inspired writings, render miracles superfluous, and if we neglect to apply truths in expectation of wonders, or under pretext of the cessation of the latter, we tempt God, and merit the same reply which our Lord gave to the Pharisees on a like occasion. In the sermon and the notes both the historical truth and the necessity of the miracles are strongly and frequently asserted. The testimony of books of history, that is, relatively to the signs and wonders, with which Christ came, is one of the strong and stately pillars of the Church, but it is not the foundation. Instead, therefore, of defending myself, which I could easily effect by a series of passages, expressing the same opinion, from the Fathers and the most eminent Protestant divines, from the Reformation to the Revolution, I shall merely state what my belief is, concerning the true evidences of Christianity. 1. Its consistency with right reason, I consider as the outer court of the temple, the common area, within which it stands. 2. The miracles, with and through which the religion was first revealed and attested, I regard as the steps, the vestibule, and the portal of the temple. 3. The sense, the inward feeling, in the soul of each believer of its exceeding desirableness, the experience, that he needs something, joined with the strong foretokening that the redemption and the graces propounded to us in Christ are what he needs, this I hold to be the true foundation of the spiritual edifice. With the strong a priori probability that flows in from 1 and 3 on the correspondent historical evidence of 2, no man can refuse or neglect to make the experiment without guilt. But, 4, it is the experience derived from a practical conformity to the conditions of the gospel, it is the opening eye, the dawning light, the terrors and the promises of spiritual growth. The blessedness of loving God as God, the nascent sense of sin hated as sin, and of the incapability of attaining to either without Christ, it is the sorrow that still rises up from beneath and the consolation that meets it from above. The bosom treacheries of the principal in the warfare and the exceeding faithfulness and long-suffering of the uninteresting ally. In a word, it is the actual trial of the faith in Christ, with its accompaniments and results, that must form the arched roof, and the faith itself is the completing keystone. In order to an efficient belief in Christianity, a man must have been a Christian, and this is the seeming argumentum in circulo, incident to all spiritual truths, to every subject not presentable under the forms of time and space. As long as we attempt to master by the reflex acts of the understanding what we can only know by the act of becoming. Do the will of my Father, and ye shall know whether I am of God. These 4 evidences I believe to have been and still to be, for the world, for the whole Church, all necessary, all equally necessary, but at present, and for the majority of Christians born in Christian countries. I believe the 3rd and the 4th evidences to be the most operative, not as superseding but as involving a glad undoubting faith in the 2 former. Credidae, idioque intellexi, appears to me the dictate equally of philosophy and religion, even as I believe redemption to be the antecedent of sanctification, and not its consequent. All spiritual predicates may be construed indifferently as modes of action or as states of being, thus holiness and blessedness are the same idea, now seen in relation to act and now to existence. The ready belief which has been yielded to the slander of my potential infidelity, I attribute in part to the openness with which I have avowed my doubts, whether the heavy interdict, under which the name of Benedict Spinoza lies, is merited on the whole or to the whole extent. Be this as it may, I wish, however, that I could find in the books of philosophy, theoretical or moral, which are alone recommended to the present students of theology in our established schools, a few passages as thoroughly Pauline, as completely accordant with the doctrines of the established Church, as the following sentences in the concluding page of Spinoza's Ethics. Deigned quo mens hoc amore divino, seu beatitudine magis gadet, eo plus intelligit, hoc est, eo majorum in effectus habet potentiam, eo minus ab effectibus, cum mali sunt, patiter. Ac adio ex eo, quat mens hoc amore divino, seu beatitudine gadet, potestatem habet libidines coercendi, quia humana potentia ad coercendos effectus in solo intellectu consistit. Ergo nemo beatitudine gadet, quia effectus coercit, sed contra potestas libidines coercendi ex ipsa beatitudine orator. With regard to the Unitarians, it has been shamelessly asserted, that I have denied them to be Christians. God forbid. For how should I know, what the piety of the heart may be, or what quantum of error in the understanding may consist with a saving faith in the intentions and actual dispositions of the whole moral being in any one individual. Never will God reject a soul that sincerely loves him, be his speculative opinions what they may, and whether in any given instance certain opinions, be they unbelief, or misbelief, are compatible with a sincere love of God, God can only know. But this I have said, and shall continue to say, that if the doctrines, the sum of which I believe to constitute the truth in Christ, be Christianity, then Unitarianism is not, and vice versa, and that, in speaking theologically and impersonally, i.e. of philanthropism and theanthropism as schemes of belief, without reference to individuals, who profess either the one or the other, it will be absurd to use a different language as long as it is the dictate of common sense. That two opposites cannot properly be called by the same name. I should feel no offense if a Unitarian applied the same to me, any more than if he were to say, that 2 and 2 being 4, 4 and 4 must be 8. Alla Broughton. Tun men keniaphrones ochai. Ex agathon ebelin. Tun di, o katamemphant agon. Iskan oikian peresphalen kalin. Kairos elkan episo, thumos atalmos ian. This has been my object, and this alone can be my defense, and oh, that with this my personal as well as my literary life might conclude. The unquenched desire I mean, not without the consciousness of having earnestly endeavored to kindle young minds, and to guard them against the temptations of scorners, by showing that the scheme of Christianity, as taught in the liturgy and homilies of our Church, though not discoverable by human reason, is yet in accordance with it. That link follows link by necessary consequence, that religion passes out of the ken of reason only where the eye of reason has reached its own horizon. And that faith is then but its continuation, even as the day softens away into the sweet twilight, and twilight, hushed and breathless, steals into the darkness. It is night, sacred night. The upraised eye views only the starry heaven which manifests itself alone, and the outward beholding is fixed on the sparks twinkling in the awful depth, those suns of other worlds. Only to preserve the soul steady and collected in its pure act of inward adoration to the great I Am, and to the filial word that reaffirmeth it from eternity to eternity, whose choral echo is the universe. Theo, Mono, Doxa. Footnotes 1. The authority of Milton and Shakespeare may be usefully pointed out to young authors. In the Comus and other early poems of Milton there is a superfluity of double epithets. While in the Paradise Lost we find very few, in the Paradise Regained scarce any. The same remark holds almost equally true of the Love's Labor Lost, Romeo and Juliet, Venus and Adonis, and Lucrece, compared with the Lear, Macbeth, Othello, and Hamlet of our great dramatist. The rule for the admission of double epithets seems to be this, either that they should be already denizens of our language, such as blood-stained, terror-stricken, self-applauding, or when a new epithet, or one found in books only, is hazarded. That it, at least, be one word, not two words made one by mere virtue of the printer's hyphen. A language which, like the English, is almost without cases, is indeed in its very genius unfitted for compounds. If a writer, every time a compounded word suggests itself to him, would seek for some other mode of expressing the same sense, the chances are always greatly in favor of his finding a better word. Ut tanquam scopulum sic fugias insolens verbum, is the wise advice of Caesar to the Roman orators, and the precept applies with double force to the writers in our own language. But it must not be forgotten, that the same Caesar wrote a treatise for the purpose of reforming the ordinary language by bringing it to a greater accordance with the principles of logic or universal grammar. 2. See the criticisms on the Ancient Mariner, in the monthly and critical reviews of the first volume of the Lyrical Ballads. 3. This is worthy of ranking as a maxim, regula maxima, of criticism. Whatever is translatable in other and simpler words of the same language, without loss of sense or dignity, is bad. N.B. By dignity I mean the absence of ludicrous and debasing associations. 4. The Christ's Hospital phrase, not for holidays altogether, but for those on which the boys are permitted to go beyond the precincts of the school. 5. I remember a ludicrous instance in the poem of a young tradesman. No more will I endure love's pleasing pain, or round my heart's leg tie his galling chain. 6. Cooper's Task was published some time before the sonnets of Mr. Bowles, but I was not familiar with it till many years afterwards. The vein of satire which runs through that excellent poem, together with the sombre hue of its religious opinions, would probably, at that time, have prevented its laying any strong hold on my affections. The love of nature seems to have led Thomson to a cheerful religion, and a gloomy religion to have led Cooper to a love of nature. The one would carry his fellow men along with him into nature, the other flies to nature from his fellow men. In chastity of diction, however, and the harmony of blank verse, Cooper leaves Thomson immeasurably below him, yet still I feel the latter to have been the born poet. 7. Sonnet I. Pensive at eve, on the hard world I mused. And then poor heart was sad, so at the moon I gazed and sighed, for ah how soon eve saddens into night. Mine eyes perused with tearful vacancy the dampy grass, that wept and glittered in the paly ray. And I did pause me on my lonely way, and mused me on the wretched ones that pass o'er the bleak heath of sorrow. But alas! Most of myself I thought, when it befell, that the sooth spirit of the breezy wood breathed in mine ear, all this is very well, but much of one thing, is for no thing good. O my poor heart's inexplicable swell. Sonnet II. O I do love thee, meek simplicity, for of thy lays the lulling simpleness goes to my heart, and soothes each small distress. Distress the small, yet haply great to me. 'Tis true on Lady Fortune's gentlest pad I amble on, and yet I know not why. So sad I am. But should a friend and I frown, pout and part, then I am very sad. And then with sonnets and with sympathy my dreamy bosom's mystic woes I pall. Now of my false friend plaining plaintively, now raving at mankind in general. But whether sad or fierce, 'tis simple all. All very simple, meek simplicity. Sonnet III. And this reft house is that, the which he built, lamented Jack. And here his malt he pilled, cautious in vain. These rats, that squeak so wild, squeak not unconscious of their father's guilt. Did he not see her gleaming through the glade? Belike, 'twas she, the maiden all forlorn. What does she milk no cow with crumpled horn? Yet, she haunts the dale where erst she strayed. And beside her stalks her amorous knight. Still on his thighs their wonted brogues are worn. And through those brogues, still tattered and betorn, his hindward charms gleam an unearthly white. Ah! Thus through the broken clouds at night's high noon peeps to fair fragments forth the full-orbed harvest moon. The following anecdote will not be wholly out of place here, and may perhaps amuse the reader. An amateur performer in verse expressed to a common friend a strong desire to be introduced to me, but hesitated in accepting my friend's immediate offer, on the score that, he must acknowledge, the author of a confounded severe epigram on my Ancient Mariner, which had given me great pain. I assured my friend that, if the epigram was a good one, it would only increase my desire to become acquainted with the author, and begged to hear it recited, when, to my no less surprise than amusement, it proved to be one which I had myself some time before written and inserted in the Morning Post, to wit. To the author of the Ancient Mariner. Your poem must eternal be, dear sir. It cannot fail, for 'tis incomprehensible, and without head or tail. 8. Of old things all are over old. Of good things none are good enough. We'll show that we can help to frame a world of other stuff. I too will have my kings, that take from me the sign of life and death. Kingdoms shall shift about, like clouds, Obedient to my breath. Wordsworth's Rob Roy. Poet. Works, Volume 3, page 127. 9. Pope was under the common error of his age, an error far from being sufficiently exploded even at the present day. It consists, as I explained at large, and proved in detail in my public lectures, in mistaking for the essentials of the Greek stage certain rules, which the wise poets imposed upon themselves. In order to render all the remaining parts of the drama consistent with those that had been forced upon them by circumstances independent of their will. Out of which circumstances the drama itself arose. The circumstances in the time of Shakespeare, which it was equally out of his power to alter, were different, and such as, in my opinion, allowed a far wider sphere, and a deeper and more human interest. Critics are too apt to forget, that rules are but means to an end, consequently, where the ends are different, the rules must be likewise so. We must have ascertained what the end is, before we can determine what the rules ought to be. Judging under this impression, I did not hesitate to declare my full conviction, that the consummate judgment of Shakespeare, not only in the general construction, but in all the details, of his dramas, impressed me with greater wonder than even the might of his genius, or the depth of his philosophy. The substance of these lectures I hope soon to publish. And it is but a debt of justice to myself and my friends to notice, that the first course of lectures, which differed from the following courses only, by occasionally varying the illustrations of the same thoughts, was addressed to very numerous, and I need not add, respectable audiences at the Royal Institution, before Mr. Schlegel gave his lectures on the same subjects at Vienna. 10. In the course of one of my lectures, I had occasion to point out the almost faultless position and choice of words, in Pope's original compositions, particularly in his satires and moral essays. For the purpose of comparing them with his translation of Homer, which, I do not stand alone in regarding, as the main source of our pseudo-poetic diction. And this, by the by, is an additional confirmation of a remark made, I believe, by Sir Joshua Reynolds, that next to the man who forms and elevates the taste of the public, he that corrupts it, is commonly the greatest genius. Among other passages, I analyzed sentence by sentence, and almost word by word, the popular lines. As when the moon, refulgent lamp of night, etc. Iliad. B. 8. Much in the same way as has been since done, in an excellent article on Chalmers's British Poets in the Quarterly Review. The impression on the audience in general was sudden and evident, and a number of enlightened and highly educated persons, who at different times afterwards addressed me on the subject, expressed their wonder. That truth so obvious should not have struck them before. But at the same time acknowledged, so much had they been accustomed, in reading poetry, to receive pleasure from the separate images and phrases successively, without asking themselves whether the collective meaning was sense or nonsense, that they might in all probability have read the same passage again 20 times with undiminished admiration, and without once reflecting that astra fianine amphiselenine fainit eretridia, that is, the stars around, or near the full moon, shine preeminently bright, conveys a just and happy image of a moonlight sky, while it is difficult to determine whether, in the lines, around her throne the vivid planets roll, and stars unnumbered gild the glowing pole, the sense or the diction be the more absurd. My answer was that, though I had derived peculiar advantages from my school discipline, and though my general theory of poetry was the same then as now, I had yet experienced the same sensations myself, and felt almost as if I had been newly couched, when, by Mr. Wordsworth's conversation, I had been induced to re-examine with impartial strictness Gray's celebrated elegy. I had long before detected the defects in the bard, but the elegy I had considered as proof against all fair attacks. And to this day I cannot read either without delight, and a portion of enthusiasm. At all events, whatever pleasure I may have lost by the clearer perception of the faults in certain passages, has been more than repaid to me by the additional delight with which I read the remainder. Another instance in confirmation of these remarks occurs to me in The Faithful Shepherdess. Seward first traces Fletcher's lines. More foul diseases than e'er yet the hot sun bred through his burnings, while the dog pursues the raging lion, throwing the fog and deadly vapor from his angry breath, filling the lower world with plague and death. To Spenser's shepherd's calendar, the rampant lion hunts he fast, with dogs of noisome breath, whose baleful barking brings, in haste, pine, plagues, and dreary death. He then takes occasion to introduce Homer's simile of the appearance of Achilles' mail to Priam compared with the dog's star. Literally thus: for this indeed is most splendid, but it was made an evil sign, and brings many a consuming disease to wretched mortals. Nothing can be more simple as a description, or more accurate as a simile. Which, says Seward, is thus finely translated by Mr. Pope. Terrific glory, for his burning breath, taints the red air with fevers, plagues, and death. Now here, not to mention the tremendous bombast, the dog star, so called, is turned into a real dog, a very odd dog, a fire, fever, plague, and death-breathing, red, air-tainting dog, and the whole visual likeness is lost, while the likeness in the effects is rendered absurd by the exaggeration. In Spenser and Fletcher the thought is justifiable, for the images are at least consistent, and it was the intention of the writers to mark the seasons by this allegory of visualized puns. 11. Especially in this age of personality, this age of literary and political gossiping, when the meanest insects are worshipped with a sort of Egyptian superstition. If only the brainless head be atoned for by the sting of personal malignity in the tail. When the most vapid satires have become the objects of a keen public interest, purely from the number of contemporary characters named in the patchwork notes, which possess, however, the comparative merit of being more poetical than the text. And because, to increase the stimulus, the author has sagaciously left his own name for whispers and conjectures. 12. If it were worth while to mix together, as ingredients, half the anecdotes which I either myself know to be true, or which I have received from men incapable of intentional falsehood, concerning the characters, qualifications, and motives of our anonymous critics, whose decisions are oracles for our reading public, I might safely borrow the words of the apocryphal Daniel, "Give me leave, O sovereign public, and I shall slay this dragon without sword or staff." For the compound would be as the pitch, and fat, and hair, which Daniel took, and did seethe them together, and made lumps thereof, this he put in the dragon's mouth, and so the dragon burst in sunder. And Daniel said, Lo, these are the gods why ye worship. 13. This is one instance among many of deception, by the telling the half of a fact, and omitting the other half, when it is from their mutual counteraction and neutralization, that the whole truth arises, as a tertium aliquid different from either. Thus in Dryden's famous line, "Great wit, meaning genius, to madness sure is near allied." Now if the profound sensibility, which is doubtless one of the components of genius, were alone considered, single and unbalanced, it might be fairly described as exposing the individual to a greater chance of mental derangement. But then a more than usual rapidity of association, a more than usual power of passing from thought to thought, and image to image, is a component equally essential, and to the due modification of each by the other the genius itself consists. So that it would be just as fair to describe the earth, as in imminent danger of exorbitating, or of falling into the sun, according as the asserter of the absurdity confined his attention either to the projectile or to the attractive force exclusively. 14. For as to the devotees of the circulating libraries, I dare not compliment their pastime, or rather kill time, with the name of reading. Call it rather a sort of beggarly daydreaming, during which the mind of the dreamer furnishes for itself nothing but laziness, and a little mawkish sensibility, while the whole material and imagery of the doze is supplied ab extra by a sort of mental camera obscura manufactured at the printing office, which pro tempore fixes, reflects, and transmits the moving phantasms of one man's delirium, so as to people the barrenness of 100 other brains afflicted with the same trance or suspension of all common sense and all definite purpose. We should therefore transfer this species of amusement, if indeed those can be said to retire amuses, who were never in their company, or relaxation be attributable to those, whose bows are never bent, from the genus, reading. To that comprehensive class characterized by the power of reconciling the two contrary yet coexisting propensities of human nature, namely, indulgence of sloth, and hatred of vacancy. In addition to novels and tales of chivalry to prose or rhyme, by which last I mean neither rhythm nor meter, this genus comprises as its species, gaming, swinging or swaying on a chair or gate, spitting over a bridge, smoking, snuff-taking. Tête-à-tête quarrels after dinner between husband and wife, conning word by word all the advertisements of a daily newspaper in a public house on a rainy day, etc. 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 15. XXIV. Pediculos e capillis excerptos in arnam jacere incantusos, eating of unripe fruit, gazing on the clouds, and, engineer, on movable things suspended in the air, riding among a multitude of camels, frequent laughter. Listening to a series of jests and humorous anecdotes, as when, so to modernize the learned Saracen's meaning, one man's droll story of an Irishman inevitably occasions another's droll story of a Scotchman, which again, by the same sort of conjunction disjunctive, leads to some etrudery of a Welshman, and that again to some sly hit of a Yorkshireman. The habit of reading tombstones in churchyards, etc. By the by, this catalogue, strange as it may appear, is not insusceptible of a sound psychological commentary. 16. I have ventured to call it unique. Not only because I know no work of the kind in our language, if we accept a few chapters of the old translation of Froissart, none, which uniting the charms of romance and history, keeps the imagination so constantly on the wing, and yet leaves so much for after reflection. But likewise, and chiefly, because it is a compilation, which, in the various excellencies of translation, selection, and arrangement, required and proves greater genius in the compiler, as living in the present state of society, than in the original composers. 17. It is not easy to estimate the effects which the example of a young man as highly distinguished for strict purity of disposition and conduct, as for intellectual power and literary acquirements, may produce on those of the same age with himself, especially on those of similar pursuits and congenial minds. For many years, my opportunities of intercourse with Mr. Southey have been rare, and at long intervals. But I dwell with unabated pleasure on the strong and sudden, yet I trust not fleeting, influence, which my moral being underwent on my acquaintance with him at Oxford, whither I had gone at the commencement of our Cambridge vacation on a visit to an old schoolfellow. Not indeed on my moral or religious principles, for they had never been contaminated, but in awakening the sense of the duty and dignity of making my actions accord with those principles, both in word and deed. The irregularities only not universal among the young men of my standing, which I always knew to be wrong, I then learned to feel as degrading. Learned to know that an opposite conduct, which was at that time considered by us as the easy virtue of cold and selfish prudence, might originate in the noblest emotions, in views the most disinterested and imaginative. It is not however from grateful recollections only, that I have been impelled thus to leave these my deliberate sentiments on record, but in some sense as a debt of justice to the man, whose name has been so often connected with mine for evil to which he is a stranger. As a specimen I subjoin part of a note, from the Beauties of the Anti-Jacobin, in which, having previously informed the public that I had been dishonored at Cambridge for preaching deism, at a time when, for my youthful ardor in defense of Christianity, I was decried as a bigot by the proselytes of French fi-, or to speak more truly losophy, the writer concludes with these words. Since this time he has left his native country, commenced citizen of the world, left his poor children fatherless, and his wife destitute. His friends, Lamb and Southy. With severest truth it may be asserted that it would not be easy to select two men more exemplary in their domestic affections than those whose names were thus printed at full length as in the same rank of morals with a denounced infidel and fugitive, who had left his children fatherless and his wife destitute. Is it surprising, that many good men remained longer than perhaps they otherwise would have done adverse to a party, which encouraged and openly rewarded the authors of such atrocious calumnies? Qualis es, Necio. Sed per qualis agis, scio et dolio. 18. In opinions of long continuance, and in which we have never before been molested by a single doubt, to be suddenly convinced of an error, is almost like being convicted of a fault. There is a state of mind, which is the direct antithesis of that, which takes place when we make a bull. The bull namely consists in the bringing her two incompatible thoughts, with the sensation, but without the sense, of their connection. The psychological condition, or that which constitutes the possibility, of this state, being such disproportionate vividness of two distant thoughts, as extinguishes or obscures the consciousness of the intermediate images or conceptions, or wholly abstracts the attention from them. Thus in the well-known bull, I was a fine child, but they changed me. The first conception expressed in the word I, is that of personal identity, ego contemplans. The second expressed in the word me, is the visual image or object by which the mind represents to itself its past condition, or rather, its personal identity under the form in which it imagined itself previously to have existed, ego contemplatus. Now the change of one visual image for another involves in itself no absurdity, and becomes absurd only by its immediate juxtaposition with the fast thought, which is rendered possible by the whole attention being successively absorbed to each singly, so as not to notice the interjacent notion, changed, which by its incongruity, with the first thought, I, constitutes the bull. Add only, that this process is facilitated by the circumstance of the words I, and me, being sometimes equivalent, and sometimes having a distinct meaning. Sometimes, namely, signifying the act of self-consciousness, sometimes the external image in and by which the mind represents that act to itself, the result and symbol of its individuality. Now suppose the direct contrary state, and you will have a distinct sense of the connection between two conceptions, without that sensation of such connection which is supplied by habit. The man feels as if he were standing on his head, though he cannot but see that he is truly standing on his feet. This, as a painful sensation, will of course have a tendency to associate itself with him who occasions it. Even as persons, who have been by painful means restored from derangement, are known to feel an involuntary dislike towards their physician. 19. Without however the apprehensions attributed to the pagan reformer of the poetic republic. If we may judge from the preface to the recent collection of his poems, Mr. W. would have answered with Xanthias. Su di bucadices tun huafon tun remitten. Kai tas apilas, xan ou ma di, bud, effrontisa. René, 492-3. And here let me hint to the authors of the numerous parodies, and pretended imitations of Mr. Wordsworth's style, that at once to conceal and convey wit and wisdom in the semblance of folly and dullness, as is done in the clowns and fools, nay even in the Dogberry, of our Shakespeare, is doubtless a proof of genius, or at all events of satiric talent. But that the attempt to ridicule a silly and childish poem, by writing another still sillier and still more childish, can only prove, if it prove anything at all, that the parodist is a still greater blockhead than the original writer, and, what is far worse, a malignant coxcomb to boot. The talent for mimicry seems strongest where the human race are most degraded. The poor, naked half-human savages of New Holland were found excellent mimics, and, in civilized society, minds of the very lowest stamp alone satirize by copying. At least the difference which must blend with and balance the likeness, in order to constitute a just imitation, existing here merely in caricature, detracts from the libeler's heart, without adding an iota to the credit of his understanding. 20. The butterfly the ancient Grecians made. The soul's fair emblem, and its only name. But of the soul, escaped the slavish trade of mortal life. For to this earthly frame, ours is the reptile's lot, much toil, much blame. Manifold motions making little speed. And to deform and kill the things whereon we feed. 21. Mr. Wordsworth, even in his two earliest poems, The Evening Walk and the Descriptive Sketches, is more free from this latter defect than most of the young poets his contemporaries. It may however be exemplified, together with the harsh and obscure construction, in which he more often offended, in the following lines. Mid stormy vapors ever driving by. Where ospreys, cormorants, and herons cry. Where hardly given the hopeless waste to cheer. Denied the bread of life the foodful ear. Dwindles the pear on autumn's latest spray. An apple sickens pale in summer's ray. Even here content has fixed her smiling reign. With independence, child of high disdain. I hope, I need not say, that I have quoted these lines for no other purpose than to make my meaning fully understood. It is to be regretted that Mr. Wordsworth has not republished these two poems entire. 22. This is effected either by giving to the one word a general, and to the other an exclusive use, as, to put on the back, and to endorse. Or by an actual distinction of meanings, as, naturalist, and physician, or by difference of relation, as, I, and, me, each of which the rustics of our different provinces still use in all the cases singular of the first personal pronoun. Even the mere difference, or corruption, in the pronunciation of the same word, if it have become general, will produce a new word with a distinct signification, thus, property, and propriety. The latter of which, even to the time of Charles II was the written word for all the senses of both. There is a sort of minim immortal among the animalcula infusoria, which has not naturally either birth, or death, absolute beginning, or absolute end, for at a certain period a small point appears on its back, which deepens and lengthens till the creature divides into two, and the same process recommences in each of the halves now become integral. This may be a fanciful, but it is by no means a bad emblem of the formation of words, and may facilitate the conception, how immense a nomenclature may be organized from a few simple sounds by rational beings in a social state. For each new application, or excitement of the same sound, will call forth a different sensation, which cannot but affect the pronunciation. The after recollections of the sound, without the same vivid sensation, will modify it still further till at length all trace of the original likeness is worn away. 23. I ought to have added, with the exception of a single sheet which I accidentally met with at the printer's. Even from this scanty specimen, I found it impossible to doubt the talent, or not to admire the ingenuity, of the author. That his distinctions were for the greater part unsatisfactory to my mind, proves nothing against their accuracy, but it may possibly be serviceable to him, in case of a second edition, if I take this opportunity of suggesting the query. Whether he may not have been occasionally misled, by having assumed, as to me he appears to have done, the non-existence of any absolute synonyms in our language? Now I cannot but think, that there are many which remain for our posterity to distinguish and appropriate, and which I regard as so much reversionary wealth in our mother tongue. When two distinct meanings are confounded under one or more words, and such must be the case, as sure as our knowledge is progressive and of course imperfect, erroneous consequences will be drawn. And what is true in one sense of the word will be affirmed as true in toto. Men of research, startled by the consequences, seek in the things themselves, whether in or out of the mind, for a knowledge of the fact, and having discovered the difference, remove the equivocation either by the substitution of a new word, or by the appropriation of one of the two or more words, which had before been used promiscuously. When this distinction has been so naturalized and of such general currency that the language does as it were think for us, like the sliding rule which is the mechanic's safe substitute for arithmetical knowledge, we then say that it is evident to common sense. Common sense, therefore, differs in different ages. What was born and christened in the schools passes by degrees into the world at large, and becomes the property of the market and the tea table. At least I can discover no other meaning of the term, common sense, if it is to convey any specific difference from sense and judgment engineer, and where it is not used scholastically for the universal reason. Thus in the reign of Charles II the philosophic world was called to arms by the moral sophisms of Hobbes, and the ablest writers exerted themselves in the detection of an error, which a schoolboy would now be able to confute by the mere recollection, that compulsion and obligation conveyed two ideas perfectly disparate, and that what appertained to the one had been falsely transferred to the other by a mere confusion of terms. 24. I here use the word idea in Mr. Hume's sense on account of its general currency amongst the English metaphysicians. Though against my own judgment, for I believe that the vague use of this word has been the cause of much error and more confusion. The word, idea, in its original sense as used by Pindar, Aristophanes, and in the Gospel of St. Matthew, represented the visual abstraction of a distant object, when we see the whole without distinguishing its parts. Plato adopted it as a technical term, and as the antithesis to eidolon, or sensuous image. The transient and perishable emblem, or mental word, of the idea. Ideas themselves he considered as mysterious powers, living, seminal, formative, and exempt from time. In this sense the word idea became the property of the Platonic school. And it seldom occurs in Aristotle, without some such phrase annexed to it, as according to Plato, or as Plato says. Our English writers to the end of the reign of Charles II or somewhat later, employed it either in the original sense, or platonically, or in a sense nearly correspondent to our present use of the substantive, ideal. Always however opposing it, more or less to image, whether of present or absent objects. The reader will not be displeased with the following interesting exemplification from Bishop Jeremy Taylor. St. Louis the King sent Ivo Bishop of Chartres on an embassy, and he told, that he met a grave and stately matron on the way with a censer of fire in one band, and a vessel of water in the other. And observing her to have a melancholy, religious, and fantastic deportment and look, he asked her what those symbols meant, and what she meant to do with her fire and water. She answered, My purpose is with the fire to burn paradise, and with my water to quench the flames of hell, that men may serve God purely for the love of God. But we rarely meet with such spirits which love virtue so metaphysically as to abstract her from all sensible compositions, and love the purity of the idea. Descartes having introduced into his philosophy the fanciful hypothesis of material ideas, or certain configurations of the brain, which were as so many molds to the influxes of the external world, Locke adopted the term, but extended its signification to whatever is the immediate object of the mind's attention or consciousness. Hume, distinguishing those representations which are accompanied with a sense of a present object from those reproduced by the mind itself, designated the former by impressions, and confined the word idea to the latter. 25. I am aware, that this word occurs neither in Johnson's dictionary nor in any classical writer. But the word, to intend, which Newton and others before him employ in this sense, is now so completely appropriated to another meaning, that I could not use it without ambiguity, while to paraphrase the sense, as by render intense, would often break up the sentence and destroy that harmony of the position of the words with the logical position of the thoughts, which is a beauty in all composition, and more especially desirable in a close philosophical investigation. I have therefore hazarded the word, intensify, though, I confess, it sounds uncouth to my own ear. 26. And coxcombs vanquish Berkeley by a grin. 27. Videlicet. Quantity, quality, relation, and mode, each consisting of 3 subdivisions. See Kritik der reinen Vernunft. See 2 the judicious remarks on Locke and Hume. 28. St. Luke X, 21. 29. An American Indian with little variety of images, and a still scantier stock of language, is obliged to turn his few words to many purposes. By likenesses so clear and analogies so remote as to give his language the semblance and character of lyric poetry interspersed with grotesques. Something not unlike this was the case of such men as Bayman and Fox with regard to the Bible. It was their sole armory of expressions, their only organ of thought. 30. The following burlesque on the Fichtean egoismus may, perhaps, be amusing to the few who have studied the system, and to those who are unacquainted with it. May convey as tolerable a likeness of Fichte's idealism as can be expected from an avowed caricature. The categorical imperative, or the enunciation of the new Teutonic god, Ego and Capon, a dithyrambic ode, by Querkopf von Klubstick, grammarian, and subrector in Gemasic. EU. De vices gerens, ipsi divus. Speak English, friend. The God imperativus. Here on this market cross aloud I cry. I. I itself I. The form and the substance, the what and the why. The when and the where, and the low and the high. The inside and outside, the earth and the sky. I, you and he, you and I. All souls and all bodies are I itself I. All I itself I. Fools! A truce with this starting. All my I. All my I. He's a heretic dog who but adds Betty Martin. Thus cried the god with high imperial tone. In robe of stiff estate, that scoffed at beauty. A pronoun verb imperative he shone. Then substantive and plural singular grown. He thus spake on. Behold in I alone. For ethics boast a syntax of their own. Or if in ye, yet as I doth depute ye. In O. I, you, the vocative of duty. I of the world's whole lexicon the root. Of the whole universe of touch, sound, sight. The genitive and ablative to boot. The accusative of wrong, the nominative of right. And in all cases the case absolute. Self-construed, I all other moods decline. Imperative, from nothing we derive us. Yet as a superpostulate of mine. Unconstrued antecedents I assign. To X, Y, Z, the God infinitivus. 31. It would be an act of high and almost criminal injustice to pass over in silence the name of Mr. Richard Saumarez, a gentleman equally well known as a medical man and as a philanthropist, but who demands notice on the present occasion as the author of A New System of Physiology, in 2 volumes octavo, published 1797. And in 1812 of An Examination of the Natural and Artificial Systems of Philosophy which now prevail, in 1 volume octavo, entitled, The Principles of Physiological and Physical Science. The latter work is not quite equal to the former in style or arrangement, and there is a greater necessity of distinguishing the principles of the author's philosophy from his conjectures concerning color, the atmospheric matter, comets, etc. Which, whether just or erroneous, are by no means necessary consequences of that philosophy. Yet even in this department of this volume, which I regard as comparatively the inferior work, the reasonings by which Mr. Saumarez invalidates the immanence of an infinite power in any finite substance are the offspring of no common mind, and the experiment on the expansibility of the air is at least plausible and highly ingenious. But the merit, which will secure both to the book and to the writer a high and honorable name with posterity, consists in the masterly force of reasoning, and the copiousness of induction, with which he has assailed. And, in my opinion, subverted the tyranny of the mechanic system in physiology. Established not only the existence of final causes, but their necessity and efficiency to every system that merits the name of philosophical. And, substituting life and progressive power for the contradictory inert force, has a right to be known and remembered as the first instaurator of the dynamic philosophy in England. The author's views, as far as concerns himself, are unborrowed and completely his own, as he neither possessed nor do his writings discover, the least acquaintance with the works of Kant. In which the germs of the philosophy exist, and his volumes were published many years before the full development of these germs by Schelling. Mr. Saumarez's detection of the Brownian system was no light or ordinary service at the time, and I scarcely remember in any work on any subject a confutation so thoroughly satisfactory. It is sufficient at this time to have stated the fact. As in the preface to the work, which I have already announced on the logos, I have exhibited in detail the merits of this writer, and genuine philosopher, who needed only have taken his foundation somewhat deeper and wider to have superseded a considerable part of my labors. 32. But for sundry notes on Shakespeare, and other pieces which have fallen in my way, I should have deemed it unnecessary to observe, that discourse here, or elsewhere does not mean what we now call discoursing. But the discursion of the mind, the processes of generalization and subsumption, of deduction and conclusion. Thus, philosophy has hitherto been discursive, while geometry is always and essentially intuitive. 33. Revelation XX. 3. 34. See Lang's History of Scotland. Walter Scott's Bards, Ballads, etc. 35. Thus organization and motion are regarded as from God, not in God. 36. Job, chapter 28. 37. Wherever A equals B, and A is not equals B, are equally demonstrable, the premise in each undeniable, the induction evident, and the conclusion legitimate, the result must be either that contraries can both be true, which is absurd, or that the faculty and forms of reasoning employed are inapplicable to the subject, i.e., that there is a metabasis eis allogenos. Thus, the attributes of space and time applied to spirit are heterogeneous, and the proof of this is, that by admitting them explicite or implicite contraries may be demonstrated true, i.e., that the same, taken in the same sense, is true and not true. That the world had a beginning in time and a bound in space, and that the world had not a beginning and has no limit, that a self-originating act is, and is not possible, are instances. 38. To those, who design to acquire the language of a country and the country itself, it may be useful, if I mention the incalculable advantage which I derived from learning all the words, that could possibly be so learned. With the objects before me, and without the intermediation of the English terms. It was a regular part of my morning studies for the first 6 weeks of my residence at Ratzeburg, to accompany the good and kind old pastor, with whom I lived, from the cellar to the roof, through gardens, farmyard, etc. And to call the minutest, thing by its German name. Advertisements, farces, jest books, and the conversation of children while I was at play with them, contributed their share to a more homelike acquaintance with the language than I could have acquired from works of polite literature alone. Or even from polite society. There is a passage of hearty sound sense in Luther's German letter on interpretation, to the translation of which I shall prefix, for the sake of those who read the German, yet are not likely to have dipped often in the massive folios of this heroic reformer, the simple, sinewy, idiomatic words of the original. Den man muss nicht die Buchstaben in der lateinischen Sprache fragen wie man soll Deutsch reden, sondern man muss die Mutter in Hause, die Kinder auf den Gassen, den gemeinen Mann auf dem Markt. Darum fragen, und den selbigen auf das Mal sehen wie sie reden, und darnach dolmetschen. So verstehen sie es den, und merken das man Deutsch mit ihnen redet. Translation. For one must not ask the letters in the Latin tongue, how one ought to speak German. But one must ask the mother in the house, the children in the lanes and alleys, the common man in the market, concerning this, and look at the moves of their mouths while they are talking, and thereafter interpret. They understand you then, and mark that one talks German with them. 39. This paraphrase, written about the time of Charlemagne, is by no means deficient in occasional passages of considerable poetic merit. There is a flow, and a tender enthusiasm in the following lines, at the conclusion of chapter 11, which, even in the translation will not, I flatter myself, fail to interest the reader. Ottfried is describing the circumstances immediately following the birth of our Lord. She gave with joy her virgin breast. She hid it not, she bared the breast, which suckled that divinest babe. Blessed, blessed were the breasts, which the Saviour infant kissed. And blessed, blessed was the mother, who wrapped his limbs in swaddling clothes. Singing placed him on her lap, hung o'er him with her looks of love, and soothed him with a lulling motion. Blessed, for she sheltered him from the damp and chilling air. Blessed, blessed, for she lay with such a babe in one blessed bed, close as babes and mothers lie. Blessed, blessed evermore, with her virgin lips she kissed, with her arms, and to her breast she embraced the babe divine, her babe divine the Virgin Mother. There lives not on this ring of earth a mortal that can sing her praise. Mighty Mother, Virgin pure, in the darkness and the night. For us she bore the heavenly Lord. Most interesting is it to consider the effect, when the feelings are wrought above the natural pitch by the belief of something mysterious, while all the images are purely natural. Then it is, that religion and poetry strike deepest. 40. Lord Grenville has lately reasserted, in the House of Lords, the imminent danger of a revolution in the earlier part of the war against France. I doubt not, that his lordship is sincere. And it must be flattering to his feelings to believe it. But where are the evidences of the danger, to which a future historian can appeal? Or must he rest on an assertion? Let me be permitted to extract a passage on the subject from the Friend. I have said that to withstand the arguments of the lawless, the anti-Jacobins proposed to suspend the law, and by the interposition of a particular statute to eclipse the blessed light of the universal sun. That spies and informers might tyrannize and escape in the ominous darkness. Oh! If these mistaken men, intoxicated with alarm and bewildered by that panic of property, which they themselves were the chief agents in exciting, had ever lived in a country where there really existed a general disposition to change and rebellion. Had they ever travelled through Sicily, or through France at the first coming on of the Revolution, or even, alas, through too many of the provinces of a sister island, they could not but have shrunk from their own declarations concerning the state of feeling and opinion at that time predominant throughout Great Britain. There was a time, heaven grant that that time may have passed by, when by crossing a narrow strait, they might have learned the true symptoms of approaching danger, and have secured themselves from mistaking the meetings and idle rant of such sedition, as shrank appalled from the sight of a constable. For the dire murmuring and strange consternation which precedes the storm or earthquake of national discord. Not only in coffee-houses and public theatres, but even at the tables of the wealthy, they would have heard the advocates of existing government defend their cause in the language and with the tone of men who are conscious that they are in a minority. But in England, when the alarm was at its highest, there was not a city, no, not a town or village, in which a man suspected of holding democratic principles could move abroad without receiving some unpleasant proof of the hatred in which his supposed opinions were held by the great majority of the people. And the only instances of popular excess and indignation were on the side of the government and the established church. But why need I appeal to these invidious facts? Turn over the pages of history and seek for a single instance of a revolution having been effected without the concurrence of either the nobles, or the ecclesiastics, or the moneyed classes, in any country, in which the influences of property had ever been predominant, and where the interests of the proprietors were interlinked. Examine the revolution of the Belgic provinces under Philip II, the civil wars of France in the preceding generation, the history of the American Revolution, or the yet more recent events in Sweden and in Spain. And it will be scarcely possible not to perceive that in England from 1791 to the Peace of Amiens there were neither tendencies to confederacy nor actual confederacies, against which the existing laws had not provided both sufficient safeguards and an ample punishment. But alas! The panic of property had been struck in the first instance for party purposes, and when it became general, its propagators caught it themselves and ended in believing their own lie. Even as our bulls to Borrowdale sometimes run mad with the echo of their own bellowing. The consequences were most injurious. Our attention was concentrated on a monster, which could not survive the convulsions, in which it had been brought forth, even the enlightened Burke himself too often talking and reasoning, as if a perpetual and organized anarchy had been a possible thing. Thus while we were warring against French doctrines, we took little heed whether the means by which we attempted to overthrow them, were not likely to aid and augment the far more formidable evil of French ambition. Like children we ran away from the yelping of a cur, and took shelter at the heels of a vicious war horse. Volume 2. Essay I, page 21, 4th edit. 41. I seldom think of the murder of this illustrious prince without recollecting the lines of Valerius Flaccus. Super ipsius ingens. Instat fama viri, virtus quod laeta tyranno. Ergo antiire metus, juvenemque extingere pregit. Argonaut, I, 29. 42. The era de kai tun kina kai tain dorkata. Kai tun lagoon, kai to tun tauron genos. Manuel File, de Animal. Proprietat. Sect. I, 12. 43. Paradise Regained. Book 4. I, 261. 44. Vita e Costumi di Dante. 45. Translation, with the greatest possible solicitude avoid authorship. Too early or immoderately employed, it makes the head waste and the heart empty, even were there no other worse consequences. A person, who reads only to print, to all probability reads amiss. And he, who sends away through the pen and the press every thought, the moment it occurs to him, will in a short time have sent all away, and will become a mere journeyman of the printing office, a compositor. To which I may add for myself, that what medical physiologists affirm of certain secretions applies equally to our thoughts. They too must be taken up again into the circulation, and be again and again resecreted to order to ensure a healthful vigor, both to the mind and to its intellectual offspring. 46. This distinction between transcendental and transcendent is observed by our elder divines and philosophers, whenever they express themselves scholastically. Dr. Johnson indeed has confounded the two words. But his own authorities do not bear him out. Of this celebrated dictionary I will venture to remark once for all, that I should suspect the man of a morose disposition who should speak of it without respect and gratitude as a most instructive and entertaining book, and hitherto, unfortunately, an indispensable book. But I confess, that I should be surprised at hearing from a philosophic and thorough scholar any but very qualified praises of it, as a dictionary. I am not now alluding to the number of genuine words omitted. For this is, and perhaps to a greater extent, true, as Mr. Wakefield has noticed, of our best Greek lexicons, and this too after the successive labors of so many giants in learning. I refer at present both to omissions and commissions of a more important nature. What these are, me saltem judice, will be stated at full in the Friend, republished and completed. I had never heard of the correspondence between Wakefield and Fox till I saw the account of it this morning, September 16, 1815, in the Monthly Review. I was not a little gratified at finding, that Mr. Wakefield had proposed to himself nearly the same plan for a Greek and English dictionary, which I had formed, and began to execute, now 10 years ago. But far, far more grieved am I, that he did not live to complete it. I cannot but think it a subject of most serious regret, that the same heavy expenditure, which is now employing in the republication of Stephanus Augmented, had not been applied to a new lexicon on a more philosophical plan, with the English, German, and French synonyms as well as the Latin. In almost every instance the precise individual meaning might be given in an English or German word, whereas in Latin we must too often be contented with a mere general and inclusive term. How indeed can it be otherwise, when we attempt to render the most copious language of the world, the most admirable for the fineness of its distinctions, into one of the poorest and most vague languages? Especially when we reflect on the comparative number of the works, still extant, written while the Greek and Latin were living languages. Were I asked what I deemed the greatest and most unmixed benefit, which a wealthy individual, or an association of wealthy individuals could bestow on their country and on mankind, I should not hesitate to answer: a philosophical English dictionary. With the Greek, Latin, German, French, Spanish, and Italian synonyms, and with correspondent indexes. That the learned languages might thereby be acquired, better, in half the time, is but a part, and not the most important part, of the advantages which would accrue from such a work. Oh! If it should be permitted by Providence, that without detriment to freedom and independence our government might be enabled to become more than a committee for war and revenue. There was a time, when everything was to be done by government. Have we not flown off to the contrary extreme? 47. April, 1825. If I did not see it with my own eyes, I should not believe that I had been guilty of so many hydrostatic bulls as bellow in this unhappy allegory or string of metaphors. How a river was to travel uphill from a vale far inward, over the intervening mountains, Morpheus, the dream weaver, can alone unriddle. I am ashamed and humbled. S. T. Coleridge. 48. Ennead, 3. 8, 3. The force of the Greek sunianai is imperfectly expressed by, understand, our own idiomatic phrase, to go along with me, comes nearest to it. The passage, that follows, full of profound sense, appears to me evidently corrupt. And in fact no writer more wants, better deserves, or is less likely to obtain, a new and more correct edition ti aun sunianai. Odi to genome non esti theema emen, syopesis, malum, theema, emen syoposis, kai physiai genome non theorema, kai moi genomini ek theorias tes odi, tain physn echin philotheomona aparchiai. Malum, kai moi he genomini ek theorias audis odis. What then are we to understand? That whatever is produced is an intuition, I silent, and that, which is thus generated, is by its nature a theorem or form of contemplation, and the birth which results to me from this contemplation, attains to have a contemplative nature. So Synesius. Otis Hiera. Arita Gunna. The after comparison of the process of the Natura Naturans with that of the Geometrician is drawn from the very heart of philosophy. 49. This is happily effected in 3 lines by Synesius, in his 3rd hymn. En kai panta, taken by itself, is Spinozism. En di apentun, a mere anima mundi. Nte pro panton, is mechanical theism. But unite all 3, and the result is the theism of St. Paul and Christianity. Synesius was censured for his doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul. But never, that I can find, arraigned or deemed heretical for his pantheism, though neither Giordano Bruno, nor Jacob Bayman ever avowed it more broadly. Mistas de noos. Ta te kai ta legii. But han araden. Amphicorion. Su to tikton ephus, su to tiktomenon. Su to photizon. Su to lampomenon. Su to phenomenon. Su to cryptomenon. Edies augais. En kai panta. En kath hudo. Kai dia panton. Pantheism is therefore not necessarily irreligious or heretical, though it may be taught atheistically. Thus Spinoza would agree with Synesius in calling God physis en noerois, the nature and intelligences, but he could not subscribe to the preceding nous kai noros, i.e. himself intelligence and intelligent. In this biographical sketch of my literary life I may be excused, if I mention here, that I had translated the 8 hymns of Synesius from the Greek into English Anacreontics before my 15th year. 50. See Shell. Abhandel. Zur Erlutter. De Id der Wissenschaftslehre. 51. Des Cartes, dis. De Methodo. 52. The impossibility of an absolute thing, substantia unica, as neither genus, species, nor individuum, as well as its utter unfitness for the fundamental position of a philosophic system, will be demonstrated in the critique on Spinozism in the 5th treatise of my Logosophia. 53. It is most worthy of notice, that in the first revelation of himself, not confined to individuals. Indeed in the very first revelation of his absolute being, Jehovah at the same time revealed the fundamental truth of all philosophy, which must either commence with the absolute, or have no fixed commencement, that is, cease to be philosophy. I cannot but express my regret, that in the equivocal use of the word that, for in that, or because, our admirable version has rendered the passage susceptible of a degraded interpretation in the mind of common readers or hearers. As if it were a mere reproof to an impertinent question, I am what I am, which might be equally affirmed of himself by any existent being. The Cartesian cogito ergo sum is objectionable, because either the cogito is used extra gradum, and then it is involved to the sum and is tautological, or it is taken as a particular mode or dignity, and then it is subordinated to the sum as the species to the genus, or rather as a particular modification to the subject modified, and not preordinated as the arguments seem to require. For cogito is sum cogitans. This is clear by the inevidence of the converse. Cogitat, ergo est is true, because it is a mere application of the logical rule, quicquid in genere est, est in specie. Est, cogitans, ergo est. It is a cherry tree. Therefore it is a tree. But, est ergo cogitat, is illogical, for quod est in specie, non necessario in genere est. It may be true. I hold it to be true, that quicquid vir est per verum sui affirmationem. But it is a derivative, not an immediate truth. Here then we have, by anticipation, the distinction between the conditional finite, which, as known in distinct consciousness by occasion of experience, is called by Kant's followers the empirical, and the absolute I am, and likewise the dependence or rather the inherence of the former in the latter, in whom we live, and move, and have our being, as est. Paul divinely asserts, differing widely from the theists of the mechanic school, as Sir J. Newton, Locke, and others, who must say from whom we had our being, and with it life and the powers of life. 54. Translation. Hence it is clear, from what cause many reject the notion of the continuous and the infinite. They take, namely, the words irrepresentable and impossible in one and the same meaning. And, according to the forms of sensuous evidence, the notion of the continuous and the infinite is doubtless impossible. I am not now pleading the cause of these laws, which not a few schools have thought proper to explode, especially the former, the law of continuity. But it is of the highest importance to admonish the reader, that those, who adopt so perverted a mode of reasoning, are under a grievous error. Whatever opposes the formal principles of the understanding and the reason is confessedly impossible. But not therefore that, which is therefore not amenable to the forms of sensuous evidence, because it is exclusively an object of pure intellect. For this non-coincidence of the sensuous and the intellectual, the nature of which I shall presently lay open, proves nothing more, but that the mind cannot always adequately represent to the concrete and transform into distinct images abstract notions derived from the pure intellect. But this contradiction, which is in itself merely subjective, i.e. an incapacity in the nature of man, too often passes for an incongruity or impossibility in the object, i.e. the notions themselves, and seduces the incautious to mistake the limitations of the human faculties for the limits of things, as they really exist. I take this occasion to observe, that here and elsewhere Kant uses the term intuition, and the verb active, inturi Germanis anschauen, for which we have unfortunately no correspondent word, exclusively for that which can be represented in space and time. He therefore consistently and rightly denies the possibility of intellectual intuitions. But as I see no adequate reason for this exclusive sense of the term, I have reverted to its wider signification, authorized by our elder theologians and metaphysicians, according to whom the term comprehends all truths known to us without a medium. From Kant's treatise De Mundi Sensibilis et Intelligibilis Forma et Principiis. 1770. 55. Frank. Baconis de Verlum, Novum Organum. 56. This phrase, a priori, is in common, most grossly misunderstood, and as absurdity burdened on it, which it does not deserve. By knowledge a priori, we do not mean, that we can know anything previously to experience, which would be a contradiction in terms. But that having once known it by occasion of experience, that is, something acting upon us from without, we then know, that it must have existed, or the experience itself would have been impossible. By experience only now, that I have eyes. But then my reason convinces me, that I must have had eyes in order to the experience. 57. J. Taylor's Biographia. 58. Par. Lost. Book V. I. 469. 59. Leibniz. Opt. 2. p. 2. Page 53. T. 3. Page 321. 60. Senecio Episcop. Hymn. 3, I, 231. 61. Anaia Morianus, a phrase which I have borrowed from a Greek monk, who applies it to a patriarch of Constantinople. I might have said, that I have reclaimed, rather than borrowed, it, for it seems to belong to Shakespeare, de jure singulari, ediex privilegio naturae. 62. First published in 1803. 63. These thoughts were suggested to me during the perusal of the madrigals of Giovanbattista Strozzi published in Florence in May, 1593, by his sons Lorenzo and Filippo Strozzi, with a dedication to their paternal uncle. Signor Leone Strozzi, General del Battaglia di Santa Chiesa. As I do not remember to have seen either the poems or their author mentioned in any English work, or to have found them in any of the common collections of Italian poetry, and as the little work is of rare occurrence, I will transcribe a few specimens. I have seldom met with compositions that possessed, to my feelings, more of that satisfying entireness, that complete adequateness of the manner to the matter which so charms us in Anacreon, joined with the tenderness, and more than the delicacy of Catullus. Trifles as they are, they were probably elaborated with great care, yet to the perusal we refer them to a spontaneous energy rather than to voluntary effort. To a cultivated taste there is a delight in perfection for its own sake, independently of the material in which it is manifested, that none but a cultivated taste can understand or appreciate. After what I have advanced, it would appear presumption to offer a translation. Even if the attempt were not discouraged by the different genius of the English mind and language, which demands a denser body of thought as the condition of a high polish, than the Italian. I cannot but deem it likewise an advantage in the Italian tongue, in many other respects inferior to our own, that the language of poetry is more distinct from that of prose than with us. From the earlier appearance and established primacy of the Tuscan poets, concurring with the number of independent states, and the diversity of written dialects, the Italians have gained a poetic idiom. As the Greeks before them had obtained from the same causes with greater and more various discriminations, for example, the Ionic for their heroic verses, the Attic for their iambic, and the two modes of the Doric for the lyric or sacerdotal, and the pastoral, the distinctions of which were doubtless more obvious to the Greeks themselves than they are to us. I will venture to add one other observation before I proceed to the transcription. I am aware that the sentiments which I have avowed concerning the points of difference between the poetry of the present age, and that of the period between 1500 and 1650, are the reverse of the opinion commonly entertained. I was conversing on this subject with a friend, when the servant, a worthy and sensible woman, coming in, I placed before her two engravings, the one a pinky-colored plate of the day, the other a masterly etching by Salvator Rosa from one of his own pictures. On pressing her to tell us, which she preferred, after a little blushing and flutter of feeling, she replied, "Why, that, sir, to be sure." Pointing to the ware from the Fleet Street print shops, "It's so neat and elegant. T'other is such a scratchy slovenly thing." An artist, whose writings are scarcely less valuable than his pictures, and to whose authority more deference will be willingly paid, than I could even wish should be shown to mine, has told us, and from his own experience too, that good taste must be acquired, and like all other good things, is the result of thought and the submissive study of the best models. If it be asked, but what shall I deem such? The answer is, presume those to be the best, the reputation of which has been matured into fame by the consent of ages. For wisdom always has a final majority, if not by conviction, yet by acquiescence. In addition to Sir J. Reynolds I may mention Harris of Salisbury, who in one of his philosophical disquisitions has written on the means of acquiring a just taste with the precision of Aristotle, and the elegance of Quintilian. Madrigali. Gelido suo Russell chiaro, e tranquillo. M'insegno amor di state a mezzo el giorno. Ardian lo salve, ardian lo piag, e I colli. And io, ch al piu gran gelo ardo e sfavillo. Subito corsi. Maas I puro adorno. Gersin il vidi, che turber noel vali. Sol mi specchiava, e in dolce ambrosa sponda. Mi stava intento al mormor del onda. Or del engocioso viver mio. Refrigerio soave. E dolce si, che piu non mi par grave. Nel ardor, nel morir, ens, il dicio. Dev oil ghiaccio, e lo nubi, el tempo rio. Discaxiatino mai, che l'onda chiara. E lumbra non men cara. A scherzer, a canta per suoi boschetti. E prati festa e di allegrezza aletti. Pacifiche, ma spesso in amorosa. Guerra cofiori, e l'erba. Alla stagione serba. Verdi insegni del giglio e della rosa. Movit, or, pien pien, che tregua o posa. Se non pace, io ritrove. E so ben dove, o vago, a mansueto. Scardo, o labbra di ambrosia, o rider, lido. Horcum un scolio stasi. Horcum un rio sien fug. Ed hor crud orsa rug. Hor canta angelo pio, ma che non faci. E che non fami, o sassy. O rivi, o baloo, o di, questa mia vaga. Non so, essi ninfa, o magna. Non so, essi donna, o da. Non so, essi dolce, o arie. Piangendo mi baciast. E ridendo il negast. In doglia habivi pin. In festa habivi ria. Nac gioia di pianti. Dolor di riso, o amanti. Miseri, habiate insiem. Ognier pora e spem. Bel fear, tu mi remembri. La rugiadosa guancia del bet viso. Esi vera elisembri. Che nte sovant, cum in lei emafiso. E hor del vago riso. Hor del serene scardo. Io per seco rigardo. Ma qual fug. O rosa, Illinois matin leave. E chi te, cum neve. El mio sortico, e la mia vita strug. Anna mia, Anna dolce, o sempre nuovo. E piu chiaro concento. Quanta dolcezza sento. In sol Anna dicendo. Io mi per pruovo. Nica tra noi retruovo. Nitra cieli armonia. Che del bel nome soa più dolce sia. Altro il cielo, altro amore. Altro non suona l'eco del mio cor. Hor che il prato, e la selva si scoiora. Al tua serena umbroso. Muovine, alto riposo. De chio riposi una sol notte, un'ora. Han lo fear, e gita jelly, ognen talora. Ha qualche pace, io quando. Lasso. Non va narrando. E non piango, e non grido. E qual per forte. Ma poish, non sent egli, o dine, mort. Risi e piansi d'amor, ini pero mai. Se non in fiamma, o en onda, o en vento scrisai. Spesso mers trovai. Crudel. Semper in me morto, in altri vici. Horda, piu scuri abissi al ciel emisai. Hor eni per cadi giusso. Stance al fin ca sun chusso. 64. I've measured it from side to side. 'Tis 3 feet long, and 2 feet wide. 65. Nay, rack your brain, 'tis all in vain. I'll tell you everything I know. But to the thorn, and to the pond. Which is a little step beyond. I wish that you would go. Perhaps, when you are at the place, you something of her tale may trace. I'll give you the best help I can. Before you up the mountain go. Up to the dreary mountain top. I'll tell you all I know. 'Tis now some 22 years. Since she, her name is Martha Ray, gave, with a maiden's true goodwill, her company to Stephen Hill. And she was blithe and gay. And she was happy, happy still. Weener she thought of Stephen Hill. And they had fixed the wedding day. The morning that must wed them both. But Stephen to another maid had sworn another oath. And, with this other maid, to church. Unthinking Stephen went. Poor Martha! On that woeful day, a pang of pitiless dismay into her soul was sent. A fire was kindled in her breast, which might not burn itself to rest. They say, full 6 months after this, while yet the summer leaves were green, she to the mountain top would go. And there was often seen, 'tis said a child was in her womb. As now to any eye was plain, she was with child, and she was mad. Yet often she was sober sad, from her exceeding pain. Oh me! 10,000 times I'd rather that he had died, that cruel father. Last Christmas when they talked of this, old Farmer Simpson did maintain that in her womb the infant wrought about its mother's heart, and brought her senses back again. And when at last her time drew near, her looks were calm, her senses clear. No more I know, I wish I did. And I would tell it all to you. For what became of this poor child, there's none that ever knew. And if a child was born or no, there's no one that could ever tell. And if 'twas born alive or dead, there's no one knows, as I have said. But some remember well that Martha Ray about this time would up the mountain often climb. 66. It is no less an error in teachers, than a torment to the poor children, to enforce the necessity of reading as they would talk. In order to cure them of singing as it is called, that is, of too great a difference, the child is made to repeat the words with his eyes from off the book. And then, indeed, his tones resemble talking, as far as his fears, tears and trembling will permit. But as soon as the eye is again directed to the printed page, the spell begins anew. For an instinctive sense tells the child's feelings, that to utter its own momentary thoughts, and to recite the written thoughts of another, as of another, and a far wiser than himself, are two widely different things. And as the two acts are accompanied with widely different feelings, so must they justify different modes of enunciation. Joseph Lancaster, among his other sophistications of the excellent Dr. Bell's invaluable system, cures this fault of singing, by hanging fetters and chains on the child, to the music of which one of his schoolfellows, who walks before, dolefully chants out the child's last speech in confession, birth, parentage, and education. And this soul-benumbing ignominy, this unholy and heart-hardening burlesque on the last fearful infliction of outraged law, in pronouncing the sentence to which the stern and familiarized judge not seldom bursts into tears, has been extolled as a happy and ingenious method of remedying, what? And how? Why, one extreme in order to introduce another, scarce less distant from good sense, and certainly likely to have worse moral effects, by enforcing a semblance of petulant ease and self-sufficiency, in repression and possible after-perversion of the natural feelings. I have to beg Dr. Bell's pardon for this connection of the two names, but he knows that contrast is no less powerful a cause of association than likeness. 67. Altered from the description of nightmare in the remorse. O heaven! 'Twas frightful. Now ran down and stared at by hideous shapes that cannot be remembered. Now seeing nothing and imagining nothing, but only being afraid, stifled with fear. While every goodly or familiar form had a strange power of spreading terror round me. N.B. Though Shakespeare has, for his own all-justifying purposes, introduced the nightmare with her own foals, yet mare means a sister, or perhaps a hag. 68. But still more by the mechanical system of philosophy which has needlessly infected our theological opinions, and teaching us to consider the world in its relation to God, as of a building to its mason, leaves the idea of omnipresence a mere abstract notion in the stateroom of our reason. 69. As the ingenious gentleman under the influence of the tragic muse contrived to dislocate, I wish you a good morning, sir. Thank you, sir, and I wish you the same, into 2 blank verse heroics. To you a morning good, good sir. I wish. You, sir. I thank, to you the same wish I. In those parts of Mr. Wordsworth's works which I have thoroughly studied, I find fewer instances in which this would be practicable than I have met to many poems, where an approximation of prose has been sedulously and on system guarded against. Indeed, excepting the stanzas already quoted from the Sailor's Mother, I can recollect but one instance, that is to say, a short passage of 4 or 5 lines in the Brothers, that model of English pastoral, which I never yet read with unclouded eye. James, pointing to its summit, over which they had all purposed to return together, informed them that he would wait for them there. They parted, and his comrades passed that way some 2 hours after, but they did not find him at the appointed place, a circumstance of which they took no heed, but one of them, going by chance into the house, which at this time was James's house, learnt there, that nobody had seen him all that day. The only change which has been made is in the position of the little word there in 2 instances, the position in the original being clearly such as is not adopted in ordinary conversation. The other words printed in italics were so marked because, though good and genuine English, they are not the phraseology of common conversation either in the word put in apposition, or in the connection by the genitive pronoun. Men in general would have said, but that was a circumstance they paid no attention to, or took no notice of, and the language is, on the theory of the preface, justified only by the narrator's being the vicar. Yet if any ear could suspect, that these sentences were ever printed as metre, on those very words alone could the suspicion have been grounded. 70. I had in my mind the striking but untranslatable epithet, which the celebrated Mendelssohn applied to the great founder of the critical philosophy, der Allersermulmen Kant, that is, the all-becrushing. Or rather the all-to-nothing crushing Kant. In the facility and force of compound epithets, the German from the number of its cases and inflections approaches to the Greek, that language so blessed in the happy marriage of sweet words. It is in the woeful harshness of its sounds alone that the German need shrink from the comparison. 71. Sammlung einiger Abhandlungen von Christian Garve. 72. Sonnet 9. 73. Mr. Wordsworth's having judiciously adopted concourse wild in this passage for a wild scene as it stood to the former edition, encourages me to hazard a remark, which I certainly should not have made in the works of a poet less austerely accurate in the use of words, than he is, to his own great honor. It respects the propriety of the word, scene, even in the sentence in which it is retained. Dryden, and he only in his more careless verses, was the first, as far as my researches have discovered, who for the convenience of rhyme used this word in the vague sense, which has been since too current even in our best writers. And which, unfortunately, I think, is given as its first explanation in Dr. Johnson's dictionary and therefore would be taken by an incautious reader as its proper sense. In Shakespeare and Milton the word is never used without some clear reference, proper or metaphorical, to the theatre. Thus Milton: cedar, and pine, and fir, and branching palm. A sylvan scene, and, as the ranks ascend, shade above shade, a woody theatre of stateliest view. I object to any extension of its meaning, because the word is already more equivocal than might be wished, inasmuch as to the limited use, which I recommend, it may still signify 2 different things. Namely, the scenery, and the characters and actions presented on the stage during the presence of particular scenes. It can therefore be preserved from obscurity only by keeping the original signification full in the mind. Thus Milton again: prepare thee for another scene. 74. Which Copeland scarce had spoke, but quickly every hill upon her verge that stands, the neighboring valleys fill. Helvellon from his height, it through the mountains threw. From whom as soon again, the sound Dunbowrace drew. From whose stone-trophied head, it on the windross went. Which towardiest the sea again, resounded it to dent. That broad water, therewith within her banks astound. In sailing to the sea, told it to eager mound. Whose buildings, walks, and streets, with echoes loud and long, did mightily commend old Copeland for her song. Drayton's Polyalbion, Song XXX. 75. Translation. It behoves me to side with my friends, but only as far as the gods. 76. Slender. I bruised my shin with playing with sword and dagger for a dish of stewed prunes, and by my troth I cannot abide the smell of hot meat since. So again, Evans. I will make an end of my dinner, there's pippins and cheese to come. 77. This was accidentally confirmed to me by an old German gentleman at Helmstadt, who had been Klopstock's school and bedfellow. Among other boyish anecdotes, he related that the young poet set a particular value on a translation of the Paradise Lost, and always slept with it under his pillow. 78. Klopstock's observation was partly true and partly erroneous. In the literal sense of his words, and, if we confine the comparison to the average of space required for the expression of the same thought in the two languages, it is erroneous. I have translated some German hexameters into English hexameter, and find, that on the average 3 English lines will express 4 lines German. The reason is evident, our language abounds in monosyllables and disyllables. The German, not less than the Greek, is a polysyllable language. But in another point of view the remark was not without foundation. For the German possessing the same unlimited privilege of forming compounds, both with prepositions and with epithets, as the Greek, it can express the richest single Greek word in a single German one, and is thus freed from the necessity of weak or ungraceful paraphrases. I will content myself with one at present, viz. the use of the prefixed participles ver, zur, ent, and weg, thus reisen to rend, verreisen to rend away, zerreisen to rend to pieces, intreisen to rend off or out of a thing, in the active sense, or schmelzen to melt, ver, zur, ent. Schmelzen, and in like manner through all the verbs neuter and active. If you consider only how much we should feel the loss of the prefix be, as in bedropt, besprinkle, besought, especially in our poetical language. And then think that this same mode of composition is carved through all their simple and compound prepositions, and many of their adverbs. And that with most of these the Germans have the same privilege as we have of dividing them from the verb and placing them at the end of the sentence. You will have no difficulty in comprehending the reality and the cause of this superior power in the German of condensing meaning, in which its great poet exulted. It is impossible to read half a dozen pages of Wieland without perceiving that in this respect the German has no rival but the Greek. And yet I feel, that concentration or condensation is not the happiest mode of expressing this excellence, which seems to consist not so much in the less time required for conveying an impression, as in the unity and simultaneousness with which the impression is conveyed. It tends to make their language more picturesque, it depictures images better. We have obtained this power in part by our compound verbs derived from the Latin, and the sense of its great effect no doubt induced our Milton both to the use and the abuse of Latin derivatives. But still these prefixed particles, conveying no separate or separable meaning to the mere English reader, cannot possibly act on the mind with the force or liveliness of an original and homogeneous language such as the German is. And besides are confined to certain words. 79. Precludere calumnium, in the original. 80. Better thus, forma specifica per formam individualum translucens, or better yet, species individualisata, siv individuum quilibet speciae determinati in omni part correspondens iti quasi version quadam eam interpretans iti repetens. 81. The big round tears coursed one another down his innocent nose. In piteous chase. Says Shakespeare of a wounded stag hanging its head over a stream, naturally, from the position of the head, and most beautifully. From the association of the preceding image, of the chase, in which the poor sequestered stag from the hunter's aim had ta'en a hurt. In the supposed position of Bertram, the metaphor, if not false, loses all the propriety of the original. 82. Among a number of other instances of words chosen without reason, Imogen in the first act declares that thunderstorms were not able to intercept her prayers for the desperate man, in desperate ways who dealt. Yeah. When the launched bolt did sear her sense. Her soul's deep orisons were breathed for him. That is, when a red-hot bolt, launched at her from a thundercloud, had cauterized her sense, to plain English, burnt her eyes out of her head, she kept still praying on. Was not this love? Yea, thus doth woman love. 83. This sort of repetition is one of this writer's peculiarities, and there is scarce a page which does not furnish one or more instances, XXIV in the first page or two. Act 1, line 7th, and deem that I might sleep. Line 10, did rock and quiver in the bickering glare. Lines 14, 15, 16, but by the momently gleams of sheeted blue, did the pale marbles dare so sternly on me, I almost deemed they lived. Line 37, the glare of hell. Line 35, O holy prior, this is no earthly storm. Line 38, this is no earthly storm. Line 42, dealing with us. Line 43, deal thus sternly. Line 44, speak. Thou hast something seen. A fearful sight. Line 45, what hast thou seen? A piteous, fearful sight. Line 48, quivering gleams. Line 50, in the hollow pauses of the storm. Line 61, the pauses of the storm, etc. 84. The child is an important personage, for I see not by what possible means the author could have ended the second and third acts but for its timely appearance. How ungrateful then not further to notice its fate. 85. Classically too, as far as consists with the allegorizing fancy of the modern, that still striving to project the inward, contradistinguishes itself from the seeming ease with which the poetry of the ancients reflects the world without. Casimir affords, perhaps, the most striking instance of this characteristic difference. For his style and diction are really classical, while Cowley, who resembles Casimir in many respects, completely barbarizes his Latinity, and even his meter, by the heterogeneous nature of his thoughts. That Dr. Johnson should have passed a contrary judgment, and have even preferred Cowley's Latin poems to Milton's, is a caprice that has, if I mistake not, excited the surprise of all scholars. I was much amused last summer with the laughable affright, with which an Italian poet perused a page of Cowley's Davideis, contrasted with the enthusiasm with which he first ran through, and then read aloud, Milton's Mansus and Ad Patrem. 86. Flectit, or if the meter had allowed, Primit would have supported the metaphor better. 87. Poor unlucky metaphysics. And what are they? A single sentence expresses the object and thereby the contents of this science. Nothai soten. Nos te ipsum. Tuc deum, quantum licet, inc deo omnia noscas. Know thyself, and so shalt thou know God, as far as is permitted to a creature, and in God all things. Surely, there is a strange, nay, rather too natural, aversion to many to know themselves.